The festive spirit filled the city. Heavy snow blanketed the streets. Crowds packed every sidewalk, and people squeezed past one another to keep warm. In the middle of it all, one family strolled along peacefully. The father chatted with his daughter, and the little girl excitedly declared that it had been the best day ever. Their peaceful walk came to an abrupt halt when they ran into a human roadblock. A towering young man in a dark overcoat stood directly in their path. The little girl froze, stunned by how unbelievably huge he was. The giant didn't say a single word. Keeping the same icy expression, he simply stepped aside and silently let the family pass. As he continued down the crowded sidewalk, his thoughts started racing. A brief wave of annoyance hit him, making him wonder why he always had to be the one who moved out of everyone else's way. The answer came almost immediately. Looking around at the sea of people, he realized he was the only one walking completely alone. He kept making his way toward the subway entrance, his boots crunching through the snow. Then he suddenly stopped in his tracks. His walk came to a dead halt as his eyes locked onto something lying ahead. An instinctive grunt escaped him when he spotted the obstacle. A mysterious figure curled up in the snow, wrapped in a purple coat. The obstacle turned out to be an old man dressed as Santa Claus, slumped beside a piece of cardboard that promised to listen to people's Christmas wishes. The sight reminded the young man that he wasn't the only lonely person caught up in the holiday rush. His first instinct was to ignore the homeless man and head straight home, but the date weighed heavily on his mind. It was Christmas Eve, the exact anniversary of the accident that had taken his parents and left him completely alone in the world. He decided to make an exception. Kneeling down, he placed a bill and a wrapped sandwich on top of the homemade sign. Then, in a calm voice, he mentioned that the food was still fresh and ready to eat. The response was immediate. The old man lunged forward and grabbed the young man's hand with shocking strength and speed. Bursting with excitement, Santa praised the young man's kindness and demanded to know his greatest wish so he could repay the favor. Regret hit him instantly. Breaking into a cold sweat and staring at the old man like he was completely insane, the young man tried to pull away and coldly ordered him to let go. This was exactly why he hated breaking his routine. It always turned into a headache. Things only got worse when he tried to escape. He pulled with all his strength, but the old man's grip was unbelievably powerful. The realization hit him immediately. He had never been physically overpowered by anyone before, yet here he was, completely restrained by a homeless man. Ignoring his struggle, the old man kept insisting that the only thing standing between him and returning to his homeland was granting the wish of such a kind-hearted soul. The young man finally gave up. Tired of struggling, he threw in the towel. The deal was simple. If he made the stupid wish, the old man would let him go. After getting the eager confirmation he wanted, the young man tried to brush him off by asking to win the grand lottery jackpot. The lie didn't work. Santa demanded the one wish the young man had kept buried deep inside. The pressure finally broke him. His cold mask crumbled away, replaced by sorrow as memories of his parents' funeral came flooding back. The painful truth was that all he really wanted was genuine love and a family that would never leave him. Finally opening up, he confessed his true dream, to have a loving wife and an unbelievably adorable little daughter. The old man's grip tightened even more. Then, in a bizarre move, he sniffed the air, claiming he could smell the sincerity behind that wish. The homeless Santa declared that the young man had been swallowed by loneliness for a very long time, and celebrated the fact that he had finally come across a soul so perfectly compatible with his own. The atmosphere turned completely ominous. The old man's expression changed, revealing eyes glowing with an eerie crimson light and a deeply unsettling grin. He promised to keep his end of the bargain, swearing to deliver a pure-hearted wife and a devoted daughter. Panic took over. Using sheer brute force, the young man yanked his arm free from the impossible grip and bolted down the street, running as fast as he could from the crazy man dressed as Santa. His frantic escape down the subway stairs left him drenched in sweat. Even from above, the insane Santa's voice echoed behind him, shouting that his Christmas magic would make the wish come true and that he was rooting for everything to work out. Inside the subway car, silence finally returned. Exhausted, the young man leaned his head against the seat, trying to process the old man's bizarre outburst. Then he noticed a couple sleeping in each other's arms nearby, along with a billboard showing the picture-perfect family from some commercial. Reality hit him. He knew the homeless man's ramblings were complete nonsense, but there was one reason he had played along. He desperately wanted the same happiness everyone else seemed to have. Overcome by loneliness and exhaustion, he drifted off to sleep. But there was nothing peaceful about it. His dreams were swallowed by an ominous purple light, a strange smell hanging in the air, and a freezing cold that had nothing to do with the city's winter. He jolted awake with a start. Dizzy and realizing he wasn't wearing a shirt, he reached for his aching head. The pain disappeared in an instant, replaced by overwhelming panic. The modern subway car was gone. Wearing nothing but a pair of shorts, he found himself kneeling with heavy chains locked around his ankles. The subway had been replaced by a moving prison, a rough wooden wagon reinforced with iron bars, rattling through the streets of what looked like a village straight out of the Middle Ages. Completely stunned, only one thought echoed through his mind. Where the hell am I? Things got even worse when he looked at the other prisoners. The wagon was packed with filthy, bearded men dressed in rags, looking like they had stepped straight out of a history book. An insane thought flashed through his head. Somehow, he had traveled back to the Middle Ages. The metallic clanking outside only made his panic worse. Soldiers in full armor marched beside the wagon, escorting it while speaking in a completely foreign language he couldn't understand. Looking over the bizarre medieval scenery and realizing he was the only Asian person there, the truth finally hit him like a truck. Whether this was reality or some impossible hallucination, the crazy Santa's promise had come true. He had been thrown into another world. The brutal wind lashed against his nearly naked body. The cold cut straight through him, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably as he stared at his bare feet shackled in heavy chains. If he stayed like this, freezing to death was only a matter of time. That was when he noticed a motionless figure lying in the corner of the cage. The man hadn't moved an inch. He was already dead. With survival instinct overpowering his morals, the young man swallowed his disgust and crawled toward the corpse. Whispering a quiet apology, he pulled the dead man's tattered shirt off and slipped it on to fight off the freezing cold. Once he managed to warm up a little, he collapsed onto the wooden floor, breathing heavily. Lying there in that medieval nightmare, desperately trying to figure out how he was supposed to survive, he could still hear the homeless Santa's voice echoing inside his head, celebrating the Christmas magic that would supposedly change his life forever. Flat on his back against the hard wooden floor of the prison wagon, the young man stared at the ceiling, struggling to process the absurdity of it all. His mind raced. If this hell was the happy life that Subway Santa had promised him, then something had gone terribly wrong. He silently begged for the nightmare to end, and for himself to wake up at any second. But the constant rocking of the wagon along the dirt roads left no room for doubt. This was real. The days blurred together until he completely lost track of time. Despite his exhaustion, he spent the journey trying to understand the rules of this new world. The first harsh truth became obvious. He had been reduced to a slave, just like every other prisoner around him. The second discovery explained everything else. The heavily armored soldiers weren't just guards, they were slave traders. Every prisoner in the wagon was nothing more than human cargo, hauled from one village to another while they searched for buyers willing to pay the highest price. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the lock clicking open. Another round of sales was about to begin. The routine never changed. The wagon stopped. The prisoners were dragged out of the cage, and they were lined up like livestock on display. Before long, some wealthy local would arrive, carefully inspecting the merchandise from head to toe before purchasing whichever slaves looked the strongest. Accepting the role of a slave crushed his pride, but his survival instinct mattered more than his ego. Ironically, that humiliating routine became his only source of hope. Being sold meant finally escaping that filthy wooden cage. Looking over his own athletic build, the young man let out a relieved smile. He was young, healthy, and built for hard labor. With those advantages, he was certain someone would buy him and get him out of that miserable place at the very first opportunity. This new world showed no mercy. Juhwan's illusion was shattered in record time. After being rejected as worthless merchandise in village after village, his confidence crumbled, replaced by a suffocating sense of despair. Thrown carelessly back into the cage, he slammed against the wooden floor, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs. Staring up at the filthy ceiling, his thoughts sank into complete darkness. What was the point of staying alive if his future held nothing but endless suffering? Then, in the middle of that hopelessness, a memory surfaced. His mother's worried voice echoed in his mind, pleading with him to keep fighting until the very end and never give up, no matter how hopeless things became. But the cruelty of the present crushed that comforting memory almost instantly. The contrast was unbearable. Thinking back to the homeless Santa in the subway, promising him a joyful future now felt like the cruelest, most twisted joke imaginable. His sadness vanished in an instant. Pure rage took its place. His eyes locked onto a dirty fork lying on the floor of the wagon. He grabbed it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. To hell with that so-called happiness. At that moment, all he wanted was to throw this bizarre world and every tragedy from his old life straight into the trash. Consumed by unbearable anguish, the temptation to end everything hit him with full force. His trembling hand tightened around the fork as he came within a heartbeat of giving up and surrendering to absolute darkness. Then the image of his family struck him like lightning. His survival instinct roared louder than his despair. Juhwan froze. He refused to accept defeat. Rotting away like a nobody inside this cage was not an option. Deep inside, the fire to fight for the life he had always dreamed of began burning once again. Juwon's torment was suddenly interrupted by a gentle voice speaking words in an unfamiliar language. Through the iron bars of the cage, a hand suddenly reached in, offering him a loaf of freshly baked bread. Looking up, he found himself staring at the warm smile of a woman. Standing just behind her, a little blonde girl peeked out while clinging to the hem of the woman's dress, offering the first genuine warmth he had felt since this nightmare began. The makeshift weapon slipped from Juhan's hand, clattering loudly against the wooden floor. Completely exhausted and unable to process what he was seeing, he simply stared in stunned silence. Receiving even the smallest act of kindness was the last thing he had expected in a place like this. The scene shifted to the inside of a small rustic cottage, where an overwhelming silence filled the room. The woman and little Lizzie sat together at a humble table, sharing what appeared to be the last meal they had left. Lizzie ate with incredible care, making every bite count. Noticing how little food remained, the woman quietly slid her own bowl toward the little girl, firmly insisting that Lizzie needed to eat more. Lizzie immediately shook her head, fully aware of the poverty they were living in. She admitted that her stomach was still growling, but refused the sacrifice without hesitation. Showing maturity far beyond her years, she gently pushed the bowl back, making it clear that if she was still hungry, then the woman had to be starving too. The heavy silence that followed laid bare their painful reality. Taking care of each other was the only reason either of them was still alive. The quiet inside the cottage was shattered by violent pounding at the front door. The woman's face immediately stiffened as she recognized the authority in the village chief's voice coming from outside. Without waiting for a response, the man barked for the door to remain shut before dropping devastating news. The village council had reached its decision. She would be forced to marry one of the newly purchased prisoners. The order was immediate and merciless. At sunrise, she was to deliver supplies to the soldiers, then pack her belongings, and leave for the mountains with her new husband. Having delivered his ultimatum, the village chief simply turned around and walked away, leaving nothing behind but absolute terror. Horrified, the woman collapsed onto the floor, wrapping both arms tightly around Lizzie, as if she could shield the little girl from the nightmare that awaited them. Her mind spiraled into chaos. The ghosts of her past came rushing back, making her entire body tremble uncontrollably at the thought of reliving that same nightmare in the hands of another stranger. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but leaving Lizzie behind was never an option. Even though they had only been together for a short time, loyalty outweighed fear. Through muffled sobs, she silently vowed that she would never abandon the little girl, no matter what happened. The tension finally overflowed, and tears began streaming down Lizzie's face as well. The little girl's desperate cries echoed through the dark cottage. Curled up in the corner, paralyzed by fear and helplessness, the woman could do nothing but watch Lizzie break down, unable to stop thinking about what tomorrow would bring. Exhaustion finally overcame panic, and the cottage fell silent. Lizzie cried herself to sleep, curled up tightly with a small teddy bear clutched against her chest. As the woman watched the little girl sleeping, a painful realization settled over her. The same paralyzing terror tearing her apart was the very monster haunting this child as well. Little Lizzie slept peacefully, hugging her stuffed bear, completely unaware of her own tragic past. At only 5 years old, she carried the burden of being the daughter of a dead man and had once lived without even having a name. Watching her sleep pulled the woman back into her own dark memories. Her personal nightmare had begun early, when her own father traded her away for nothing more than a rabbit pelt. The moment she arrived at her new husband's cabin, the nightmare truly began. Before she could even put down her belongings, he beat her without mercy. His reason? She had been a few minutes late. That was only the beginning of a life filled with constant abuse. During one particularly brutal beating, the woman was left collapsed on the floor, physically and emotionally broken. It was in that moment that the cruel logic of that twisted world was broken. Defying the brutality surrounding them, little Lizzie slowly walked over. The little girl reached out her tiny hand, silently offering comfort. That tiny gesture carried unimaginable weight. In a world consumed by cruelty, Lizzie was the only person who had ever shown her even the smallest trace of kindness or hope. Everything changed the day her abusive husband climbed into the mountains and never came back. Rumors quickly spread throughout the village, claiming he had been torn apart by wolves during a hunt. The confirmation of his death filled her with relief, but only for a moment. That relief was immediately swallowed by fear. She knew exactly how this cruel world worked. A woman without a husband became easy prey, a wounded animal left for predators to devour. Back in the present, as they walked together, Lizzie's voice broke the silence. The little girl pointed toward the road ahead, warning that something was coming. The sight immediately caught their attention. It wasn't an ordinary supply wagon, it was a prison on wheels. Inside the swaying iron cage sat a lone prisoner bound in heavy chains. To innocent little Lizzie, it was simply another wagon passing through. But to the woman, the sight of the caged prisoner felt like a punch to the stomach. Her blood ran cold. Seeing a man chained up like that awakened an overwhelming terror, as though her worst nightmare was about to begin all over again. Her mind was dragged back into a suffocating memory. A man screaming that she was worthless, his voice exploding with uncontrollable rage. The sharp clang of a fork hitting the floor. Then his cruel snarl, claiming that merely looking at her ruined his appetite. In that horrifying memory, the only thing she could do was throw herself over Lizzie, shielding the little girl with her own body while trembling helplessly beneath his fury. Back in the present, every step toward the cage felt impossibly heavy. Her trembling hands tightly gripped a piece of bread while Lizzie hid behind her skirt, frightened by the oppressive atmosphere surrounding them. The tension reached its peak when they finally stopped in front of the iron bars. Without saying a word, the woman quietly extended the bread toward the prisoner. The only response she received was a cold, piercing stare filled with contempt. Before the situation could spiral any further, a stranger suddenly stepped in. He immediately took control. Speaking with calm authority, he took the bread from her hands and gave a direct order. His group would deal with the soldiers, and she needed to return to the village immediately. Too relieved to question him, she simply nodded. Taking Lizzie's hand, she hurried away from the dangerous scene as fast as she could. As they walked away, Lizzie glanced back one last time. Inside the cage, Juhuan remained silent, clutching the piece of bread as though it were his only remaining connection to the real world. The brief moment of peace shattered instantly. The guards began shouting, ordering the prisoner out of the cage. Chaos erupted. Juhuan was violently thrown out without the slightest care, crashing hard against the ground as he gasped desperately for air. What followed quickly turned into a nightmare on the outskirts of the village. With one short, emotionless command from an officer, the executions began. The slaughter was swift and merciless. The soldiers advanced on the defenseless prisoners, who were already kneeling on the ground. Their blades rose and fell without hesitation, painting the earth red as dozens of lives were erased within minutes. Not a single one of them had any chance to fight back. Amid the massacre, Juhuan's mind completely froze. Right before his eyes, the guards wielded real magic. Stunned and completely exhausted, he could only wonder what kind of twisted world he had fallen into. His paranoia deepened as the soldiers began whispering among themselves, slowly walking toward him with open contempt. Powerless to resist, Juhuan could only stare back in terror as the quiet countryside silently swallowed the horrifying scene. Far from there, the atmosphere inside the cottage was tense and purely transactional. One of the village women dropped off a small supply of basic food on the table, making it clear that every single grain would have to be paid back later. Without the slightest hesitation, she took a jab at the protagonist's late husband, bluntly admitting that the villagers had only tolerated him because he was useful as a watchman in the mountains. The conversation quickly shifted to the upcoming forced marriage. The visitor mentioned that the newly purchased outsider looked intimidating, but added something that didn't quite match his appearance. Despite his rugged build, his hands were as smooth and delicate as a nobleman's. Holding Lizzie close, the woman treated the gossip like a warning siren. This stranger was a dangerous mystery, and the growing pile of debts around her neck only tightened the noose even further. The villager tried to paint an optimistic picture. She insisted the outsider didn't seem like the abusive type, and claimed that, once he became the village's official hunter, he would bring wealth and stability to the household. But promises of a better life meant nothing to the woman. Her only silent prayer was that the new man of the house wouldn't raise a hand against them, and would at least let them live in peace. The quiet inside the cottage was shattered as she gently rocked Lizzie to sleep. Heavy knocks thundered against the door before it was violently thrown open. The village chief entered, dragging the prisoner from the cage behind him. It was Juhuan. Covered in bruises, he angrily complained about being yanked around while he was already injured. Curled up on the floor with Lizzie in her arms, the woman froze. The realization that this towering stranger was now her husband landed like a bomb, destroying every hope she had of feeling safe. Juhuan's sheer presence was overwhelming. The woman couldn't stop trembling at the sight of his massive frame. Juhuan, on the other hand, recognized her immediately as the woman who had offered him bread on the roadside and couldn't understand why she looked so utterly terrified of him. The tense silence was broken by the village chief's brutality. Grabbing Juhuan by the arm, the chief shoved him directly toward the woman, forcing physical contact between them. Wearing a mocking grin, he announced that the two of them were officially husband and wife now. The room became suffocating. Juhuan, unable to understand a single word of the local language, desperately tried to figure out what was happening. Then it hit him. The memory of the crazy Santa echoed through his mind, repeating the promise to give him a pure-hearted wife and an adorable daughter. Looking at the frightened pair huddled before him, Juhwan's imagination played a bizarre trick on him. The woman reminded him of a frightened little rabbit, while tiny Lizzie looked like a baby mongoose hiding behind her. Everything suddenly clicked. That encounter in the snow hadn't been a hallucination. That insane old man had actually used magic to keep his promise. Completely out of place as he stared at his new family, Juhwan struggled to process the sheer insanity of it all. His wish had come true, but one bitter thought refused to leave his mind. Did Santa seriously have to send me to another world just to get me married? Dark memories flooded Juhwan's thoughts. The weight of his painful past and the scars he carried collided violently with his new reality. Rage exploded inside him. A murderous crimson aura seemed to radiate from his body as he silently swore that he would hunt down and kill the Santa Claus responsible for throwing him into this living hell. His silent fury was so overwhelming that both the woman and Lizzie shrank back in terror, trembling before the giant standing in front of them. The scene shifted outside. Surrounded by trees and the village men, Juhwan was barely holding himself together. The chatter around him was nothing more than meaningless noise since he couldn't understand a single word they were saying. The tension rose when one of the villagers stepped forward and extended his hand for a handshake. The moment Juhwan accepted it, the man suddenly squeezed his hand with crushing force, trying to break his fingers. Not knowing whether that was simply how people greeted each other in this world, or if it was a deliberate challenge, Juhwan decided to answer in kind. He squeezed back. The villager instantly collapsed to his knees, screaming in agony, while Juhwan watched the whole thing with complete indifference. What could have turned into a massive brawl instead ended in surrender. Completely intimidated by the outsider's monstrous strength, the man backed down and, as a gesture of submission, handed Juhwan his own bow, holding the weapon without understanding the logic behind it. Juhwan read the atmosphere and came to the obvious conclusion. Nobody there wanted to fight him anymore. The threatening atmosphere transformed into comedy almost instantly. The villager suddenly began hopping around wildly while placing both hands on top of his head, pretending they were long ears. The bizarre pantomime left Juhwan completely confused. He couldn't tell whether the strange dance was supposed to imitate a rabbit or if it was simply another one of this world's incomprehensible customs. The mystery was solved a moment later. Realizing the outsider had no idea what was going on, the villager pointed toward a real rabbit standing nearby, making it clear that it was time to hunt. Bow in hand, Juhwan hesitated. Common sense told him that hitting such a tiny target from that distance was impossible unless someone possessed the accuracy of a professional athlete. Even though he doubted himself, he took his stance, drew the bowstring, and let the arrow fly. It sliced through the air with deadly precision. The animal dropped instantly, killed on the spot by a flawless shot. The perfect hit sent the villager into a frenzy of excitement, clapping and cheering at what he had just witnessed. Juhwan, on the other hand, stood there completely stunned, staring at the bow, unable to understand how he had pulled off such an incredible shot on his very first try. The shock of that shot quickly gave way to something even greater when he noticed movement along the forest trail. The woman and little Lizzie were walking toward him. The moment their eyes met, reality hit Juhwan like a truck. That silent connection drove one painful truth into his mind. The woman standing before him wasn't just a frightened villager, she was his destined fiancée. That encounter in the middle of the woods marked the exact moment he accepted the weight of his new fate. The tension slowly faded into an uneasy truce. The three of them quickly set up a small campsite in the forest, spreading a piece of cloth across the ground. Juhwan grabbed a bowl of steaming soup and started eating, all while the woman and Lizzie watched him with cautious, suspicious eyes. Sharing that meal triggered something deep inside him. The word family had always felt like a foreign concept. From his teenage years all the way into his 30s, his life had been nothing but waking up alone inside the walls of an empty room. But as he looked at the two of them sitting there, the truth became impossible to ignore. As absurd as the situation was, his days of loneliness were finally over. He had a home now. Even so, that peaceful moment kept crashing into one harsh reality. The language barrier made any real connection impossible. The pace picked up the following day. Juhwan took the lead, carrying all of their luggage on his back. Just from the sound of their breathing, he quickly realized that both the woman and little Lizzie were completely exhausted, struggling to catch their breath. The frustration of not being able to form even a single sentence to ask whether they needed a break left him feeling utterly powerless. As he forced himself to adapt to this unfamiliar world, an old memory echoed in his mind. The moment you decide to protect someone, hesitation is no longer an option. You act first. He was forced to put that lesson into practice almost immediately. Overcome by exhaustion, Lizzie burst into tears, breaking the silence of the journey. Juhwan stopped in his tracks and looked back. Seeing how drained they both were drove home the full weight of the responsibility he had taken on. From that moment forward, becoming the shield that protected their lives wasn't just a choice, it was a duty he couldn't afford to fail. Trying to calm the frightened little girl, Juhwan changed his approach. With a careful gesture, he let her know he was going to carry her, hoping to ease the fear that had frozen her in place. The mother watched everything in silence, torn between caution and disbelief. Startled by his sudden kindness, the little girl was lifted off the ground, and together with her mother, both were settled into Juhwan's arms as he made every effort to show that he had no intention of hurting either of them. The effect was immediate. Their fear slowly melted into surprised relief as he adjusted them securely in his arms, signaling for them to hold on tight. The strangest part was the physical effort, or rather, the lack of it. Even while carrying all of their travel bags along with both of them, Juhwan didn't feel even the slightest bit tired. The unnatural strength of this new world made the journey almost effortless, allowing the group to keep moving with impossible ease. Even so, the list of problems was overwhelming. As they followed the forest trail, he mentally sorted out his priorities. He desperately needed to learn the local language and master hunting, so he could make sure they would never run out of food again. The journey continued, interrupted only by the sound of their boots against the dirt. During one quiet moment, the woman gently reached up and touched Juhwan's face, looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, as though she were trying to understand the heart of the mysterious protector who had suddenly entered her life. Without saying a word, he simply kept walking, fully aware that his life now revolved around protecting them. Guided to the end of the trail, they finally arrived at the cabin that would become their new home. The freezing air hit him instantly. The tiny shack was far colder than the cramped room he had lived in back on Earth, instantly reminding him just how much he hated the cold. The moment he stepped through the doorway, the bitter chill washed over him, but getting used to the temperature would have to wait. Something strange near the entrance immediately caught his attention, bringing him to a dead stop. Chaos returned when the woman suddenly broke down in tears. Confused, Juhwan tried to approach her to figure out what was wrong, but she recoiled in panic before bolting out of the cabin. Standing in the doorway, staring into the fading evening light, the full weight of the situation finally hit him. Outside, trembling and alone, the woman revealed the awful truth. While they had been away, the entire cabin had been completely stripped clean. Every piece of furniture, every tool, every hunting weapon, and every bit of food had been stolen. They no longer had any way to repair the cabin, no protection against the deadly winter, and no means of defending themselves from the wild beasts lurking outside. Without saying a word, Juhwan walked over to her and sat beside her on the ground. In a quiet gesture of reassurance, he gently rested his hand on her head, softly stroking her hair, silently asking her not to worry. The gesture caught the woman completely off guard. Her face flushed bright red, and her eyes filled with tears as she froze, trying to process the unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. Deep down, though, panic still screamed inside her. They couldn't even exchange a single word. The young man was supposedly nothing more than an inexperienced rookie with no wilderness skills, and the threat of dying in that unforgiving land outweighed any promise he could make. Even so, Juhwan had already made up his mind. Locking eyes with her, he silently made a promise. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe, no matter how many doubts he had about what tomorrow would bring. When he gently touched her face, she instinctively lifted her chin and met his gaze. One final tear rolled down her cheek, but the fear inside her slowly gave way to overwhelming relief. Looking into his unwavering eyes, she couldn't help but wonder why she felt so safe beside him, even while everything around them had fallen apart. With gentle care, Juhwan wiped away the tears on her face, while she continued staring at him, still unable to believe that such a simple touch could bring so much comfort in the middle of complete despair. As he gently stroked her hair, Juhwan found himself lost in his own memories. He thought about the cruel world he had been torn away from, the early loss of his parents, and the endless years he had spent surviving all alone. But everything had changed now. Looking at the woman in his arms, one truth became crystal clear. He had a family now, and failure simply wasn't an option anymore. Pulling her into a firm embrace, he rested one hand on her back, giving her gentle pats in an effort to calm her endless sobbing. The look he gave her carried a silent promise that she would never have to go without anything ever again. The peaceful moment was suddenly shattered by a louder sob and a muffled cry of emotional pain. Before either of them could react, a blur of blonde hair came charging toward them. Lizzie ran over in a panic to protect the woman, throwing her arms around her and accusing Juhwan of hurting her. Still sitting on the ground with both of them clinging to him, Juhwan looked at the scene with a mixture of shock and complete confusion. For someone who had spent his entire life without experiencing real affection, trying to handle a family meltdown involving two crying girls was completely unfamiliar territory. His mind raced in circles, trying to make sense of everything that had happened that day. Why had she shared her piece of bread with him back on the road? Why was she carrying so much pain inside her? Even without any answers, he had already reached his conclusion. If the three of them worked hard together, they could escape poverty and become a real family. With a determined smile, He wrapped both of them in one big hug, silently swearing that he would make them the happiest people in the world. He promised himself that he would erase every reason they had to cry, dedicating himself to becoming the best husband and father he possibly could, so they would never regret placing their trust in him. That night came to a close as the scene shifted inside the small rustic cabin. Under the same roof, the young man, the woman, and the little girl officially took their first step toward the new life they would build together. The ice slowly began to melt. Their conversations were still far from smooth, but the woman no longer trembled with fear whenever Juhwan was nearby, replacing her terror with quiet shyness. Knowing they had to overcome the language barrier if they were going to survive together, he took the initiative. Pointing at his own chest, he clearly spoke his name out loud. The woman and the little girl looked at him in surprise. Keeping a warm smile on his face, he pointed toward her, encouraging her to do the same. After several hesitant seconds, she finally whispered her own name. His reaction was immediate. He broke into a genuine smile and warmly complimented her beautiful name. Wanting to include the little girl, Juhwan asked what her name was. The mood instantly grew heavy. She quietly shook her head, looking frightened and heartbroken. In that moment, he understood the painful truth. She didn't even have a name. Determined to change that, he gently patted the little girl's head and took it upon himself to give her one. Since she had never been given a name, he would be the one to do it. Speaking with warmth, he gave her a new name. The little girl pointed at herself in confusion before softly repeating it. Juhwan nodded with a bright smile, explaining that the name would bring good friends and lots of love into her life. The little girl's face lit up with the biggest smile, overjoyed to finally have an identity she could call her own. The atmosphere became almost magical, marking the beginning of a journey filled with new adventures and genuine love for Juhwan, the woman, and the little girl. While chopping firewood outside the cabin, Juhwan unknowingly became the center of the woman's attention. She kept stealing glances at him, completely bewildered. By the standards of her world, nothing about him made sense. He had a muscular body and large, powerful hands, far stronger than those of her late husband, yet there wasn't a trace of violence in him. The kindness he showed was something she had never experienced before. She carefully watched his every move, trying to come to terms with the fact that this man belonged to a completely different kind of person than anyone she had ever known. As she slowly tried to get used to him, she quietly repeated his name in her mind. Even though she couldn't understand Juhwan's language, she could hear the calmness in his voice and see the respectful way he carried himself, making her even more curious about the mysterious man who had entered her life. As she studied his features, especially his dark hair and dark eyes, a thought suddenly clicked in the woman's mind. Rumors about the enemy nation spoke of a secret ritual that had successfully summoned a legendary hero. According to the old legends, that hero was described exactly like this: black hair and eyes as dark as the night. Even though his appearance matched every rumor about the legendary hero summoned by the enemy kingdom, she dismissed the idea almost immediately. To her, it was ridiculous to imagine a warrior of that caliber living like a poor mountain villager instead of enjoying a luxurious life inside a royal palace. The only logical conclusion was that the whole story was nothing more than empty gossip. As she looked at him more closely, she found even more reasons to doubt it. Under the sunlight, his hair looked more brown than black, and his eyes didn't quite match the legend either. Letting out a long sigh, she felt an unexpected wave of relief after convincing herself that he was nothing more than an ordinary man, even if he was unusually large. But that feeling lasted only a second. A chill of panic suddenly ran through her body. Why was she feeling relieved because of a complete stranger? The thought made her instinctively step back just as Juhwan approached and gently rested his hand on top of her head. The touch froze her instantly. In her mind, a hand placed on her head had always meant the beginning of another beating. The trauma of her past screamed inside her, turning a simple gesture of affection into a trigger for pure terror. But the violence she expected never came. His hand was gentle and comforting. As he continued softly stroking her head, the walls she had built around herself slowly began to crumble. Her eyes closed on their own, and the warmth of that simple gesture overwhelmed her so completely that she silently wished it would never end. The mood changed in a heartbeat. The gentle moment took an unexpected turn. Juhwan's face turned bright red, and acting on pure impulse, he leaned in to kiss her. The surprise was so overwhelming that Lizzie froze where she stood, her cheeks burning red and her eyes wide open, looking as though her brain had completely shut down from emotional overload. Reality slammed into Juhwan just as fast. Realizing the unbelievably stupid thing he had almost done, he stumbled backward 3 full steps, breathing heavily, his face glowing scarlet and his mind in total chaos. The romantic atmosphere instantly collapsed into unbearable embarrassment. Too mortified to even look at them, Juhwan grabbed the nearby bucket and bolted, fleeing the scene as fast as he could while leaving Lizzie standing there, still trying to process what had just happened. Walking alone through the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon, Juhwan dragged his feet while repeatedly smacking himself on the head in frustration. He felt like a complete idiot. Sure, they were technically married, but they had literally met that very day. The language barrier only made everything worse, leaving him wondering whether he should just pretend nothing had happened the next morning. Then, in the middle of a step, he suddenly froze as a thought flashed through his mind. His lonely walk came to an abrupt halt when the atmosphere around him changed completely. The warm breeze disappeared, replaced by an icy, suffocating wind that made the tree branches creak. He stopped dead in his tracks as goosebumps spread across his arms. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. His survival instincts screamed the moment two glowing crimson eyes pierced the darkness. From the shadows emerged a colossal wolf the size of a bear, its massive fangs dripping with saliva and its eyes burning with murderous intent. Armed with nothing but a bucket, Juhwan felt his stomach sink as he stood frozen before the monstrous predator. The beast charged without hesitation, unleashing a thunderous growl that shook the ground beneath them. Snapping out of his daze, Juhwan stumbled backward in shock. A wolf, with no time to escape, his hands frantically searched the ground until they found a thick, heavy piece of wood. Adrenaline exploded through his veins as he lunged straight at the monster. The wolf charged with its jaws wide open, but Juhwan jammed the wooden log directly into its mouth. The collision echoed through the forest. The monster's massive jaws slammed shut with crushing force, splintering the wood while driving Juhwan toward the ground in a brutal struggle for survival. The pressure was overwhelming. The beast roared, saliva flying everywhere as it pinned him beneath its enormous weight. Feeling death closing in, Juhwan gritted his teeth, poured every ounce of bottled-up rage into his body, and roared back. "Damn it, you really think I'm going to die in a place like this?" That scream became the trigger. Out of nowhere, a violent blue energy erupted from his body, releasing a shockwave that bent the surrounding trees and vegetation. A split second later, the freezing cold vanished, replaced by unbearable heat. Juhwan felt his insides ignite, as though he were burning alive from the inside out. Real flames burst from his skin, surrounding him in a blazing inferno that quickly spread to the wolf's fur. Staring at his own hands as they transformed into living torches, he whispered in complete disbelief, What is this?" The battle turned around in an instant. Consumed by the fury of his newly awakened power, Juhwan threw himself at the burning beast, climbing onto the gigantic wolf's back. Driven by pure rage and supernatural fire, he unleashed a savage barrage of flaming punches, beating the creature mercilessly until the massive beast finally collapsed beneath the overwhelming force of his blows. The wolf crashed onto the forest floor, breathing heavily as blood poured from its countless wounds. Juhwan remained standing, staring at his own hands, still dazed by the terrifying strength he had just unleashed. His mind raced as he desperately tried to piece together everything that had happened only moments before. As Juhwan examined his body, a new question crossed his mind. His clothes were completely untouched, not a single tear or scorch mark, even though he had clearly seen his arms engulfed in flames. The realization slowly sank in. Had he awakened magical powers? After all, getting ridiculously overpowered abilities after being transported to another world was practically the standard plot of every fantasy story. Determined to test his theory, Juhwan flopped onto the grass, stretched one arm toward the sky, and shouted his first spell. Fireball! Nothing happened. Growing increasingly desperate, he started yelling every imaginary spell he could think of. Firestorm, firewall, fire magic, dragon breath. Then, in one last dramatic attempt, he raised his hand and shouted, "Spirits of the vast earth, arise." Total failure. Not even a tiny spark appeared. Completely drained and frustrated, Juhwan collapsed back onto the grass. As ridiculous as his failed attempts at casting magic had been, one undeniable fact remained. None of what had happened during the fight had been an illusion. The scratches covering his body had already begun to heal thanks to that mysterious energy that had erupted inside him during the battle. His expression gradually turned serious. If he could learn to control that hidden power, he would have the perfect tool to hunt, protect his family, and make sure there would always be plenty of food on their table. He pictured a future where the two of them would never have to struggle again. The exhaustion from the battle finally caught up with him, forcing him to sit down and lean against the ground for a few moments. Muttering under his breath, he couldn't help thinking that if he really knew healing magic, he would have closed his wounds instantly, especially in a brutal world like this. Dusting himself off and straightening his posture, he took a deep breath and settled on a simple motto for tomorrow: one step at a time. The world around him suddenly faded into darkness, transitioning into a painful memory from Earth. Dressed in a black suit, Juhuan was kneeling silently at a gloomy funeral. His thoughts echoed with the crushing weight of grief. Once tragedy strikes, it has a way of coming back again. Not long after losing his parents, another devastating blow had followed. Standing before the altar, he remembered his grandfather, an elderly man full of strength and kindness, the one who had taken him in after his parents' deaths, only to lose his own life in a meaningless accident not long afterward. The funeral turned into a nightmare when one furious relative completely lost control. Charging straight at Juwan, the man slammed him to the floor while screaming accusations in his face. According to him, every death was Juwan's fault. His cruel words painted him as a cursed existence, claiming that everyone around him died simply because they stayed close to him. Lying on the ground without fighting back, Juwan silently endured the assault, forever branded as the unlucky outcast who brought misfortune wherever he went. The echo of that old pain was suddenly interrupted by the present, pulling his thoughts back to the forest and the new life waiting for him. Back in the woods, Juwan wiped the sweat from his face and focused on the task ahead. To avoid attracting more predators with the smell of fresh blood, he decided to butcher the wolf later. With tremendous effort, he hoisted the massive carcass onto his shoulders and started making his way home. As the moonlight lit the forest path, memories of his grandfather hunting on the family farm resurfaced. He never imagined those childhood lessons would one day save his life in another world. He couldn't help smiling to himself, thinking that the old man would probably be proud if he could see him now. Even while carrying the enormous beast, another problem kept nagging at him. How the heck was he supposed to train that mysterious magic? When he pushed open the cabin door, he was immediately greeted by the warm glow of the fireplace, a welcome contrast to the freezing cold outside. Inside, everything felt peaceful and ordinary. Lizzie was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Dorothy happily ran over carrying a bowl. The woman smiled, thanked her, and gently patted the little blonde girl's head. Dorothy giggled before happily running across the room. The peaceful atmosphere didn't last long. Curious about a strange noise coming from a gap between the wooden planks in the wall, Dorothy leaned closer to peek through the crack. Her eyes instantly went wide. A piercing scream of pure terror shattered the silence. Dorothy froze after spotting a giant furry monster outside the wall and immediately burst into tears. Hearing the scream, Lizzie spun around in an instant, her face turning deathly pale. Without thinking twice, she dropped everything, grabbed a kitchen knife, and charged toward the opening while screaming at Dorothy to get away. The chaos reached its peak when the terrifying beast suddenly collapsed, revealing what had really been supporting its weight. Juhuan staggered into view from behind the enormous wolf's body, letting out an exhausted groan as the carcass crashed onto the floor. Frozen in the middle of her charge, Lizzie let the knife slip from her hand. It hit the floor with a metallic clang as her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. Dorothy burst into tears and ran straight to Juhuan, frantically feeling his body to make sure he was still alive. Taking a slow breath, Juhuan offered them a weak smile to reassure them that he was okay. Even though the wolf had left a nasty bite on his arm, that mysterious energy had healed almost the entire wound before he even made it back home. As the little girl clung to him, sobbing into his chest, Lizzie wrapped her arms around him as well, holding him tightly with a mix of relief and lingering fear. Juhuan understood immediately that the flood of tears came from one thing alone: they had been terrified of losing him. A wave of guilt washed over him as he remembered the promise he had made to himself that he would never let either of them cry again. Unbeknownst to them, a crow perched quietly on the cabin roof watched the scene from above. Juhuan let out a long sigh of surrender, feeling the weight of that long night finally begin to lift. Bent over the workbench, Juhuan broke out in a cold sweat as he struggled to butcher the wolf's carcass. Watching his grandfather do it had always looked effortless, but the reality was a nightmare of thick tendons and stubborn muscle. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, he muttered a quiet curse under his breath, promising himself he'd use a different technique the next time he hunted before forcing himself to finish the job. The creak of the door revealed Lizzie's silhouette in the dim light. As soon as he noticed her approaching, Juhuan straightened up, called her by name, and quickly walked over, asking her to place the cuts of meat into the bucket she was carrying. She answered with a gentle smile and held the bucket out for him. An awkward silence settled between them for a few seconds until Juhuan decided it was time to test his language skills. Swallowing his embarrassment, he forced the words out. "Thank you." The reaction was immediate. A playful grin spread across Lizzie's face. Holding back a laugh, she repeated his words in a teasing tone, leaving Juhuan completely flustered as he wondered if he had just embarrassed himself. The sweetness of the moment caught both of them by surprise. "You're welcome," Lizzie softly replied. Those simple words carried far more weight than ordinary politeness. She stood there frozen for a moment as the realization slowly sank in. Not even her own family had ever sincerely thanked her for something as ordinary as bringing over a bucket. Life with Juwon was becoming a strange collection of firsts, where even the smallest everyday moments felt completely new. While Juwon returned inside the cabin to continue working, Lizzie drifted into deep thought out in the yard. Their first kiss came rushing back into her mind, turning her cheeks bright red and making her heart pound so hard it felt ready to burst from her chest. A knot of insecurity tightened inside her. Had that moment actually meant something to him, or was he simply an experienced man acting on instinct? The uncertainty hurt, turning her excitement into a suffocating mix of hope and anxiety. Meanwhile, as they continued organizing the cuts of meat, Lizzie kept sneaking glances at him from the corner of her eye. One question refused to leave her mind. Why was he doing such heavy work? In her village, that kind of job normally belonged to the women. Her train of thought came to a violent stop when Juhwan suddenly walked straight toward her. Lizzie's brain completely short-circuited. Her heart shot into her throat as panic instantly took over. Oh no, what do I do? Terrified, her face burning bright red, she squeezed her eyes shut and braced herself while Juhwan slowly leaned closer. The romantic climax ended in the most anticlimactic way possible. Instead of kissing her lips, Juwon gently kissed her forehead. The shock was so overwhelming that Lizzie instantly jumped back, her face as red as a tomato. She was drowning in embarrassment and frustration after closing her eyes so dramatically. Alone with her racing thoughts, she mentally called herself an idiot for getting her hopes up like that. Determined to fix the awkward misunderstanding and erase any impression that she had been expecting some fairy tale romance, she marched right back in front of him, eyes wide open, locked directly onto his. She silently made herself a promise. If there was ever a next time, she wouldn't look away, and she definitely wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The romantic atmosphere barely had time to settle. Trying to act as though nothing had happened, Juwon turned back to his work before suddenly stopping. Huh? Dorothy? To Lizzie's absolute horror, the little girl had witnessed the entire forehead kiss. Unable to survive that level of embarrassment, Lizzie spun around and ran away at full speed, leaving Juhwan standing alone in the yard, completely baffled by her sudden escape. A few minutes later, the scene shifted outside once again. Juwon walked across the yard carrying a bucket, with Dorothy happily following close behind. Noticing her little pout and disappointed expression, he quickly figured out what was wrong. He hadn't thanked her personally. Softening his voice, he smiled warmly. "Thank you for helping, Dorothy." The effect was instant. The sadness vanished from the little girl's face, replaced by a bright smile that stretched from ear to ear. That one simple acknowledgement was all it took to completely make her day. Back inside the cabin, everything felt peaceful and domestic. Lizzie sat on the floor, carefully cleaning and stretching the dark wolf's hide. Watching from a distance, Juhwan briefly thought about how strong the smell must be inside the house, but the thought quickly softened into something more tender. Ah, that hide must be incredibly valuable to her. Curious as always, Dorothy soon wandered over, letting out an impressed "Ooh!" when she saw the dark fur. Without a second thought, she flopped down on top of the wolf's massive head and happily began petting its fur alongside Lizzie, creating a moment of pure peace. Standing nearby with his arms crossed, Juhwan watched the scene with a satisfied smile. Seeing how carefully Lizzie handled the meat and rendered the animals fat, he realized just how much he still had to learn about surviving in this world. Relieved that he had brought the carcass back intact, he silently promised himself that he'd master those skills eventually. For now, though, his priority was something else: trade. Determined to learn how money, commerce, and bargaining worked in this world, Juhwan decided his break was over. As he headed for the door, he found Lizzie waiting right in front of it. Trying to play the overprotective husband, he gestured for her to stay behind and rest. Lizzie refused. Shaking her head firmly, she insisted she had already recovered, that she wasn't in pain anymore, and that she wasn't planning to overwork herself. She practically begged him to stop worrying about her so much. Leaving the cabin behind, Juhwan headed into the forest for his very first real job as a lumberjack. He stopped in front of a sturdy-looking tree, judging it to be the perfect size for practice. There was just one problem. He knew oak made excellent firewood, but he had absolutely no idea how to tell an oak tree apart from any other tree before he started chopping. Still, ignoring his complete lack of technical knowledge and putting all his faith in his ridiculous physical strength, he decided experience would teach him the rest. Gripping the axe tightly, he raised it overhead and swung with everything he had. The result was a complete disaster. The axe bounced violently off the thick bark, flew straight out of his hands, threw him completely off balance, and left him standing there in one of the most embarrassingly pathetic poses imaginable. Lacking both skill and technique, Juhwan admitted defeat for the day and carried the tools back to the cabin. The moment he stepped through the door, Lizzie rushed over to greet him, only to slip. Juhwan reacted on pure instinct, catching her before she hit the floor and pulling her safely toward him. The two of them ended up sitting on the ground together as the basket of sticks scattered all around them. Blushing bright red, Lizzie looked up at him and quietly whispered, "Thank you." The awkward silence lasted exactly long enough for Dorothy to walk in and witness the entire scene. Her jaw dropped. Then she spun around in complete panic, sprinted to a nearby bucket of water, and started splashing it all over her own face as though she were desperately trying to erase the scandalous image from her memory. A second later, she charged back toward Juwan, repeatedly smacking him with tiny hands while spraying water everywhere. As Lizzie laughed at the ridiculous scene, Juwan gently stopped Dorothy by resting his hand on top of her head before formally thanking her for helping. The effect was immediate. Dorothy froze in place with a huge grin stretching from ear to ear. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last. Within seconds, she was running wildly around the cabin again, forcing Juhwan to step in and demand a little peace and quiet. Watching the cheerful chaos unfold, Juhwan couldn't help smiling. His heart felt warm. Life here felt almost like a dream. Just a few days ago, he had been completely alone. Now, he finally had something worth fighting for. Outside, thin smoke drifted peacefully from the cabin chimney. The scene shifted to dinner, where the three of them quietly shared a meal around the table. Warm glances were exchanged throughout the evening until exhaustion finally caught up with Dorothy, who nodded off on top of a nearby cushion. Careful not to wake her, Juhwan stood, gently lifted the little girl into his arms, and carried her over to the bed beside the fireplace, tucking her in comfortably near the warmth of the fire. Meanwhile, Lizzie quietly cleaned up the dishes. Feeling someone approach from behind, she stopped what she was doing as Juhwan gently took hold of her arm. When she turned around, she found him looking directly into her eyes. He hesitated, only a quiet, uncertain sound escaped his lips. The language barrier no longer mattered. Instead, he simply pulled her into a warm embrace. Wrapped safely in his arms, Lizzie melted into the hug as a deep sense of peace settled between them while night quietly stretched on outside. The intimate atmosphere deepened when Juhwan reached for the hem of his shirt to change clothes. Standing only a few feet away, Lizzie watched him with cheeks burning scarlet, trying to overcome her overwhelming shyness and reminding herself that being a wife meant taking initiative. She slowly reached out with trembling hands, grabbed the bottom of his shirt, and gently helped lift it, revealing his toned torso in the quiet cabin. Her bold attempt didn't last long. Juhwan immediately stopped moving, looked down at her, and smiled. It was calm and just a little teasing. That single smile completely shattered what little composure Lizzie had left. Her face felt like it was about to burst into flames. Ugh. Eyes squeezed tightly shut, she quickly pulled her hands back, ready to flee. But Juhwan was faster. In one smooth motion, he gently caught her wrist and pulled her back toward him. Still wearing that affectionate smile, he slowly leaned closer. Lizzie's eyes flew wide open. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it was lodged in her throat. The tension hung in the air until Juhwan quietly settled everything with a soft whisper. It was time for bed. The scene faded to the quiet night outside as Juhwan gently led Lizzie by the hand back toward the cabin. Juhwan felt how soft she was, and the comforting reality finally settled in. This woman was truly his wife. The peaceful moment soon gave way to quiet melancholy. Thinking about Lizzie and little Dorothy, sleeping only a few feet away, Juhwan silently prayed into the darkness, begging fate not to take either of them away from him. In his mind, he imagined himself shielding his family from the grotesque figure of Santa Claus, wishing for nothing more than for the three of them to keep smiling together for the rest of their lives. His thoughts suddenly drifted to the image of a lavish mansion. The nobles, surrounded by wealth and countless luxurious rooms, could never understand the lives of ordinary people. The scene shifted back to the cramped cabin, where the couple slept together on the hard floor beneath a single large blanket, squeezed tightly beside the others. For commoners, reality was brutally simple. Every house looked the same. Generation after generation grew up sleeping in the exact same tiny space their parents had once shared. Beneath the blanket, surrounded by darkness, Lizzie found herself slipping into painful memories. Sharing such a tiny room meant witnessing everything. A massive, terrifying shadow appeared in her mind, her father. His furious screams echoed through the night as he threatened to beat everyone if the crying didn't stop. The comforting crackle of burning firewood pulled her back to the present. Blinking slowly, she traded the darkness of the past for the warm glow of the fireplace. Confused, She tried to remember how she had ended up in bed so comfortably. Then she realized she was lying on a warm bed. Juwon was asleep beside her. Her face instantly turned bright red when she noticed she had been using his arm as a pillow, something she could never have imagined during the miserable life she once lived. Feeling Dorothy's calm breathing beside her, an overwhelming sense of relief filled her chest. This wasn't the kind of marriage she had always feared. This was peace. Her entire life had changed the day this man entered it. Morning finally arrived, sunlight spilling gently across the room. Rubbing his eyes with a sleepy, the scene shifted to the kitchen. Already dressed for the day, Lizzie walked over to a heavy metal bucket to begin her morning chores. Before she could even lift it, a strong hand grabbed the handle first. Caught completely off guard, she quickly turned around. Juwon was already dressed for work, wearing nothing but a calm, easygoing smile. Without saying a word, he effortlessly took over the task, leaving Lizzie speechless as the sound of water pouring echoed through the quiet morning. After finishing with the bucket, Juwon casually glanced back over his shoulder and affectionately asked Lizzie whether she had slept well. The intimate nickname he used completely short-circuited her brain. Her eyes flew wide open, her hands shot to her chest. Her entire face turned bright red. Watching his wife nervously avoid eye contact while twisting her fingers together, Juwon figured out exactly what had embarrassed her. A playful grin spread across his face. Still holding the bucket, he turned toward her completely and asked a simple question. What would she like him to call her? After several seconds of silently panicking, Lizzie gathered every ounce of courage she had left. Stammering through burning cheeks, she quietly admitted that she wanted him to keep calling her by that same affectionate nickname. The realization instantly hit Juwon. A huge teasing grin spread across his face as he happily granted her request on the spot. The effect on Lizzie was absolutely devastating. She shrank into herself, buried her face in both hands, and let out a muffled squeak of pure embarrassment. Finding her reaction absolutely adorable, Juwon walked up behind her, gently poked her shoulder, and jokingly demanded that she look him in the eyes. Meanwhile, back in the bedroom, Dorothy was waking from the strangest dream imaginable. She had apparently been chasing a flying piece of meat with angel wings. Still half asleep, a tiny string of drool hanging from her mouth while her brain slowly rebooted, Dorothy muttered the only thing that mattered to her that morning: meat. The next instant, she launched herself out of bed and sprinted toward the kitchen, guided entirely by her appetite. Hearing her coming, Juwon smiled, opened his arms wide, and got ready to welcome her with a warm good morning hug. His expectations lasted about 2 seconds. Dorothy blasted straight past both him and Lizzie like an out-of-control rocket, completely ignoring them. Her golden eyes sparkled with excitement. Drool practically poured from her mouth. Planting both feet firmly on the kitchen floor, she shouted at the top of her lungs, "Meat!" Dorothy's obsession with food led to a hilarious scene. Still consumed by her bizarre dream about meat, the little girl dove headfirst into a wooden barrel and ended up stuck from the waist up. As she kicked her legs wildly while screaming for food, Juwon burst into uncontrollable laughter, clutching his chest, while Lizzie watched the whole spectacle with an amused smile. The scene quickly shifted to the forest. Walking confidently beneath the morning sun, Juwon laughed to himself, determined to take hunting seriously from now on. Holding his axe firmly, he wore a cocky grin, completely unfazed by the thought of the wolves showing up again. But the atmosphere changed in an instant. A silent, overwhelming pressure suddenly brought Juwon to a complete stop. The entire forest seemed to change color, drowning beneath a suffocating purple haze that made even breathing feel difficult. His guard immediately went up. Cold sweat ran down his face as he tightened his grip on the axe, preparing himself for the most terrifying monster he had ever faced. What stepped onto the trail, however, wasn't a beast. From the purple-tinted shadows emerged an elderly man with a gray beard, wearing a dark cloak with its hood pulled low over his face. His expression was cold and intimidating. Startled, Juwon instinctively took a step back. The stranger shot him a sharp sideways glance before breaking the silence. "Who are you?" Staring at the blood-stained rocks and the massive tracks left behind by the colossal beast, the hooded old man quietly pieced everything together. He had been secretly watching Juwon for several days. He knew perfectly well that the young man barely knew how to swing an axe, let alone hunt. The math simply didn't add up. A complete beginner like him should never have been capable of taking down a monster of that caliber by himself. Narrowing his eyes beneath the hood, the bearded man decided to investigate personally. With slow, confident steps, he approached through the dark forest until his eyes settled on Juwon's arm. carefully examining the exposed bite marks. His reasoning came to a screeching halt. Judging by the size of the scars, it had obviously been a wolf attack. What completely defied the medical knowledge of this world, however, was the flawless condition of the healed skin. A bite powerful enough to leave wounds like that should have shredded muscle, exposed bone, and left any ordinary person bedridden with a deadly infection or simply dead from fever long ago. Yet here Juhwan stood, walking around as though nothing had happened. Faced with such an impossible sight, the old man reached only one conclusion. His dry throat tightened as he stared at Juhwan with a mixture of caution and disbelief. There was only one logical explanation. The young man had to be a mage, and not just any mage, but one of the rarest kinds imaginable. Magic users did exist in this world, but to ordinary commoners, they were little more than distant legends figures most people would never lay eyes on even once in their lifetime. Looking at the young man standing before him, the old hunter smiled inwardly. If this stranger truly possessed magic, then the opportunity he had been waiting for had finally arrived. A cruel grin slowly spread across his face as his eyes glowed with an ominous violet light. He savored the thought that fate had just handed him the perfect chance to fulfill a revenge he had long believed would die with him. On the other side, Juhwan could feel his skin burning beneath the crushing pressure. Frowning, drenched in cold sweat, he kept his eyes locked on the mysterious old man, desperately trying to figure out what kind of walking disaster stood before him. The old man's thoughts drifted back into the past. Beneath that frail, aging body lay memories forged through blood and steel. The laws of this land were merciless. Anyone appointed as a forest ranger to oversee a noble's territory was also required to periodically leave the woods and march off to war. His memories carried him back to a battlefield littered with corpses and arrows embedded in the earth, where the warriors who distinguished themselves in the slaughter were rewarded with the coveted position of becoming the Lord's personal advisor. His thoughts wandered even further back to his youth. He remembered the day he left home after a bitter falling out with his father, choosing the life of an independent hunter before eventually settling in a small village with dreams of becoming a lumberjack. His hard work paid off. Before long, he had become the village's official woodsman. The mountain region was rich with natural resources, but harvesting timber demanded extreme caution. Since the local villagers were free to gather wood from the Lord's forest, he constantly pushed deeper into the wilderness, carving out new routes farther into the mountains. Back then, he had considered it nothing more than survival training. He climbed towering cliffs. He studied the landscape from above. Only much later did he understand why everyone else limited themselves to cutting firewood near the mountain's edge. The answer had been hidden in one absurd requirement for becoming the Lord's forest ranger. Applicants had to report for duty with all 4 limbs intact. Before he ever had the chance to earn the position, fate demanded its price. His memories returned to that horrifying day. He saw himself lying in the mud of the dark forest, drenched in blood and gasping for air. Then the monster appeared again. A demonic goblin burst from the shadows, its enormous fangs dripping with saliva as it roared with murderous rage. Curled up on the ground, trembling in absolute terror, the young lumberjack learned in the cruelest way possible that the mountain hid creatures far beyond anything humans were meant to face. The old man's memories plunged even deeper into the tragedy that had shaped his entire life. He remembered the horrifying truth behind those mountains. The goblins regularly raided nearby villages, kidnapping human women and forcing them to bear their offspring. Since the village already suffered from a severe shortage of women, it eventually earned a grim nickname, the Goblin Village. In that painful memory, the young lumberjack lay helpless in the mud, letting out a muffled scream as the monster mercilessly mutilated him. Forced to live with both the physical and emotional scars of that day, he spent the following years trapped in a miserable existence. The old man admitted that only one thing had kept him alive: hatred, an all-consuming obsession with taking revenge on the monsters that had destroyed his life. Although he also carried deep resentment toward the villagers for how they had accepted the situation, his burning thirst for vengeance against the creatures themselves remained the one and only reason he had continued living. Determined to see it through to the very end, the old man swore he would endure anything. For decades, he dragged himself through life with a single goal etched into his mind: burn every last one of those cursed monsters alive until nothing remained of their nest. Back in the present, the old man's opinion of Juwan finally solidified. Looking at the young man with unwavering conviction, he realized Juwan possessed exactly the kind of power needed to fulfill his revenge. His massive physique alone was completely unlike anything normally seen in that region. The veteran studied him carefully and concluded that Juwan possessed an extraordinary regenerative ability. At this rate, the young man would soon surpass every monster hunter alive. Thinking ahead, the old man knew the goblins were still hiding deep within the mountains for now. But once they began running out of captive women, the horde would inevitably descend upon the village. Until that day came, he intended to forge Juwon into an unstoppable monster hunting machine. Putting on a friendly smile, the hooded mentor carefully concealed the existence of the goblin's lair, deciding to keep the most important part of his plan hidden until the perfect moment. Always calculating, he considered how a formal agreement would bind Juwon to him, making it impossible for the young man to simply walk away or back out later. Standing before him, Juwon politely bowed his head and let out a confused murmur. Behind his warm smile, however, the old man's experienced eyes noticed every little detail. Even while bowing, Juwon kept his weight shifted backward, ready to react at any moment. He hadn't lowered his guard for even a second. Breaking the silence, the veteran hunter extended his hand and promised to teach Juwon every technique he knew until he became a legend of the forest. Juwon simply blinked in confusion. Huh? Still completely lost. He shook hands with his brand new business partner. Time skipped forward. Juwon opened his eyes inside the cabin, feeling as though he had done nothing more than blink. Looking through the window, he spotted the hooded old man walking away from the yard. An uneasy feeling immediately settled in his stomach. He hated the thought of a stranger wandering around his home, imagining how dangerous it would be if something like that happened while he wasn't there. Meanwhile, inside the kitchen, Lizzie and Dorothy peacefully went about their day, completely unaware of the concern running through his mind. Watching the old man leave, Juwon noticed the sly grin the stranger flashed over his shoulder. It reminded him exactly of the kind of smile an HR manager gives right before announcing your benefits have been cut during a job interview. Even so, thinking about everything he could gain from learning real hunting techniques, Juwon decided to give the old man a chance. Throwing his gear bag over one shoulder, he prepared to leave. When Lizzie called out to him with worried eyes, he answered with a calm smile, reassuring her that he'd be back soon before heading out. Back in the kitchen, Lizzie clumsily tried to pack him a lunch. The adorable sight made Juwon's heart completely melt, filling him with that familiar flutter in his chest that made everything she did seem unbelievably cute. Nearby, Dorothy watched the whole scene in silence. Suddenly, the little girl dashed toward the doorway, planted herself directly in front of the exit, and crossed her arms to block his path. Juwon froze. What? Without saying a word, Dorothy held up the lunchbox Lizzie had just prepared and firmly shook her head, insisting that he take proper food with him. As Juwon adjusted the strap of his bag, he felt Lizzie quietly walk up behind him to carefully tuck one more item inside. A gentle smile spread across his face. Having a family that genuinely cared whether he survived was a feeling beyond words. A moment later, Lizzie wished him a safe trip. Trying to memorize the phrase, Juwon casually repeated the words while pointing at her, earning an enthusiastic nod of approval. He smiled and promised he'd be back soon. His wife answered with a warm wave. Dorothy immediately joined in. Running over with the biggest grin imaginable, she shouted at the top of her lungs, "Have a safe trip!" Watching both of them standing in the doorway waving goodbye, Juwon felt a painful tug in his chest. He finally admitted the truth to himself. He simply didn't want to leave. Looking back at Lizzie and Dorothy smiling from the doorway, the reason was obvious. His new wife and his daughter were far too precious for him to walk away from. The scene abruptly shifted to the sunlit forest. Juwon walked beside the hooded old man along endless mountain trails. Hour after hour passed. His enthusiasm slowly faded into exhaustion and frustration as he silently wondered just how long they had been walking and what secret the old man was hiding at the end of this seemingly endless journey. Then, without warning, the old man stopped. Juwon nearly walked straight into him. Confused, he watched as his mentor lightly tapped the ground with his foot. Is that some kind of secret signal telling me to look down? Before he could figure it out, the old man adjusted his stance and stomped firmly into the earth, pressing his boots deep into the soil. Juwon watched every movement with complete focus. As the old man resumed walking, Juwon followed behind, still frowning at the strange footprints left in the dirt. They looked wrong, unusual, almost deliberate. As they wandered deeper into the forest, Juwon's imagination drifted toward the martial arts novels he used to read. Could this be some legendary 1,000-pound step? Or maybe a secret footwork technique? Determined not to miss a single lesson, he decided there was only one solution: copy everything. With his bag slung over one shoulder and the serious expression of a man completely committed to his mission, Juwon began imitating every step the old man took, lifting his feet high before stomping heavily into the ground with each stride. Out of the corner of his eye, the hooded old man noticed what Juwon was doing. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Half amused, half impressed by his student's dedication, the mountain training continued. The old mentor taught Juwon how to identify the local vegetation, instructing him to touch every tree and memorize the unique characteristics of each species growing on the mountain. He also had him repeatedly feel the ground beneath his feet, forcing him to mentally map the terrain through touch alone. After hours of non-stop training, the pair finally stopped to rest atop a rocky plateau bathed in bright daylight. Juhwan collapsed onto a large stone with a tired sigh, while the old man remained nearby, keeping watch. Pulling out a modest lunch from the pouch at his waist, the old man quietly began eating. The moment Juhwan saw that, his face lit up with a huge grin. Perfect timing. He could finally enjoy the lunch Lizzie had lovingly prepared for him. Excitedly opening the wrapped bundle and popping open the lunchbox, Juhwan smiled as a delicious aroma drifted into the air. Unfortunately, his little feast didn't last long. Completely cutting him off, the hooded old man ordered him to shut it immediately. Blinking in shock and utterly confused, Juhwan looked at his mentor, who firmly shook his head in absolute refusal before pointing into the distance, silently warning him that an unseen danger was about to reveal itself. It didn't take long for Juhwan to connect the dots. The rich scent of freshly cooked food was like a beacon across the vast mountain, spreading quickly through the wind and attracting every hungry predator nearby. Feeling sorry for all the effort Lizzie had put into preparing such a delicious meal so early that morning, Juhwan swallowed his disappointment, closed the lunchbox, and accepted defeat with a heavy heart, knowing the feast would have to wait. Their trek through the dense forest finally ended in front of a rustic wooden cabin, the old man's hideout. The door creaked open, revealing the mentor holding a bow and several arrows, his expression as ruthless as ever. The moment Juhwan laid eyes on the weapon, he frowned, puzzled by the bow's bizarre design. Having only ever seen traditional D-shaped or C-shaped bows, he couldn't wrap his head around how anyone was supposed to fire something like that. Without giving him a chance to ask questions, the old man shoved the weapon against Juhwan's chest and motioned for him to follow. Carrying the awkward thing with complete skepticism, the young man marched behind him, doubting it would be of any real use. The sheer weight of the bow told him everything. It would take monstrous strength just to draw the string. A few yards ahead, the old man stopped, planted his feet firmly, knocked an arrow, and pulled the string back with terrifying ease. Juhwan stared in disbelief. His mentor looked like a statue. Not a single muscle trembled, as if gravity itself had no effect on him. The shot shattered the silence of the forest with a thunderous crack. The arrow tore through the air in a blur before slamming into the trunk of a massive tree with such overwhelming force that it splintered the bark and buried the steel tip deep into the wood, leaving behind a faint trail of smoke from the friction. Inspired by the display, Juhwan tried to copy the stance, straining every muscle in his body to pull the string while the old man watched with a faint smirk. Seeing how painfully slow his student was, the mentor stepped in and physically adjusted his posture. Juhwan immediately tensed up, horrified to realize the old man could maintain that rock-solid stance without the slightest effort. Steadying his mind and pouring every ounce of focus into the task, Juhwan gripped the bowstring beneath his mentor's piercing gaze. Mentally reviewing every lesson from that grueling day of training, he renewed his resolve. He had to absorb everything the old man could teach him and master the art of hunting as quickly as possible if he wanted to protect what mattered most. Juhwan's eyes burned with unwavering determination. His life's purpose was crystal clear: to become the provider his wife and daughter deserved. Back at the cabin, Dorothy sprawled across the soft bed on her back, happily kicking her arms and legs as she celebrated with a full belly. She giggled non-stop, joking that she could actually feel the meat making her stronger. Kneeling nearby, Lizzie covered her mouth to hide her affectionate laughter, her heart warming as she realized the little girl had never laughed this much before Juhwan entered their lives. To Lizzie, that happiness felt like an oasis. Before he came along, laughter had practically ceased to exist. Hearing the child's joyful giggles filled her with the same comforting warmth as sitting beside a crackling wood-burning stove. Meanwhile, Dorothy lay on the bed with rosy cheeks and a bright smile, wishing only that her food would digest faster so she could eat even more. The peaceful atmosphere, however, crumbled in an instant. The little girl's expression darkened with deep anxiety, her eyes filling with tears. She couldn't stop wondering what Juhwan truly was to her. Lizzie always said he was her husband. Knowing neither of them was her biological parent, a crushing fear took hold of her. What if one day they abandoned her, just like her real father had? What if they took only Lizzie with them and left her behind? Those fears quickly spiraled into something even darker. Cruel, sadistic voices from her past echoed through her mind, making Dorothy flinch as she looked around with a pale face. Insults like "useless girl" and bitter reminders that she'd at least be useful if she'd been born a boy to handle heavy labor pierced straight through her heart. Overwhelmed by the fear of being nothing more than a burden who wasted precious food, Dorothy rushed to the storage barrel in desperation to check their supplies. Seeing the meat was still untouched gave her a brief sense of relief, but it vanished the moment a harsh, commanding voice sliced through the air, demanding to know what she thought she was doing hiding in there. Dorothy's heart nearly leaped out of her chest. Letting out a muffled gasp, she spun around and peeked through a crack in the wooden window, freezing the instant she recognized the three men standing outside. They were the very same loan sharks and thugs who had spent years terrorizing her father with threats and brutal beatings. The memories of everything she and her stepmother had suffered hit her like a punch to the gut. Her father had always unleashed his rage on both her and her mother, but now the only person she could think about was Lizzie. A silent scream echoed through her mind. What if her stepmother was beaten to death the same way her own mother had been? Outside, her worst nightmare began coming true. One of the thugs grabbed Lizzie by the throat, shouting accusations that she'd stolen the meat because of its smell. Through trembling sobs, Lizzie stammered that her husband had hunted it himself, but the man burst into mocking laughter, dismissing her story as a ridiculous joke. As Lizzie desperately tried to defend herself, another thug cut her off with a shout, reminding everyone that her first husband was dead and claiming the new one was nothing more than decoration to keep her alive, while accusing her of living like a criminal. Having already decided to loot the place, they forced their way inside. When Lizzie stood her ground and told them to shut up, one of them shoved her so hard she crashed onto the floor. The three men stormed into the cabin, their greedy eyes sweeping over everything inside. The criminals' frantic search came to an abrupt stop the moment they spotted the massive gray wolf pelt stretched across a wooden rack. Their eyes lit up with greed. Bursting with excitement, they shouted that it was worth a fortune and that they'd just struck gold before spreading out to search every inch of the cabin. As their heavy footsteps rattled the wooden floor, Dorothy curled up beneath a piece of furniture, trembling with her heart pounding in her chest. One of the intruders cursed in disbelief that a bunch of country folk had managed to kill such a beast when Lizzie suddenly rushed into the cabin, desperately screaming for them to stop. Tears streamed down her face as Lizzie spread her arms in front of the wolf pelt, using her own body as a shield while glaring at the thugs without a trace of fear. The blonde leader smirked with utter contempt. He mocked her for finally finding her voice now that she'd gotten herself a new husband before stepping forward and delivering a brutal blow to the side of her neck, sending her crashing onto the wooden floor. Lying on the ground with a painful groan, Lizzie's eyes flew open when she noticed Dorothy hiding only a few feet away. Her face bruised and struggling to catch her breath, she turned toward the little girl, consumed by panic and desperate to protect her. While Lizzie fought to breathe, Dorothy was fighting a battle against her own terror. Tears streamed endlessly down her face as she blamed herself, convinced she was nothing but a useless coward who only knew how to hide. Despair consumed her. What was she supposed to do? On the other side of the room, the blonde leader mocked the situation, asking his men if Lizzie really thought life had gotten better just because she'd found herself another husband. One of the thugs hesitated, warning that things would go horribly wrong if the mountain guardian showed up. The blonde man laughed the warning off, arguing that the so-called guardian couldn't even understand their language, and as long as nobody talked, they'd be perfectly safe. Another thug pointed out that mountain guardians were unpredictable, and that it'd be a disaster if the mysterious man came back and discovered everything missing. Tired of the discussion, the blonde leader grabbed Lizzie by both arms, yanked her to her feet, and declared they could simply drag her into the forest instead. Holding Lizzie in place as she cried and begged for help, the blonde man delivered a venomous warning. If she told her husband a single word about what happened, they'd come back in the middle of the night, burn the cabin to the ground, and reduce everything to ashes. While the thugs cleaned out the cabin, celebrating their unbelievable luck and praying no one showed up, Lizzie was dragged outside. Hidden away, Dorothy watched everything fall apart, whispering her stepmother's name in sheer terror, convinced that something terrible was about to happen and unable to imagine what she'd do if Lizzie never came back. Left completely alone inside the now empty cabin, Dorothy broke down into uncontrollable sobs. Covering her face with her tiny hands, she cried out Juhwan's name, desperately begging him to come home as fast as he could while watching through the crack in the wall as Lizzie was mercilessly dragged away toward the dark forest. Far away, making his way through the woods beside the hooded old man, Juhwan couldn't help thinking that the day had felt like it lasted forever. Suddenly coming to a stop, he politely bowed and thanked his mentor for everything he had taught him during their journey. Then a piercing, desperate cry tore through the forest. Juhwan's eyes flew wide open in pure shock, his blood running cold the instant he recognized whose voice it was. A single name burst from his lips in alarm. Dorothy! Without a second thought, he spun around and sprinted back toward the cabin at full speed, his heart tightening beneath the crushing certainty that something catastrophic had happened to his family. His blood pumped at its absolute limit as Juhwan tore through the forest, every horrifying possibility racing through his mind. The instant he spotted the thugs dragging Lizzie away, his face twisted into a savage mask of murderous rage. Without wasting even a fraction of a second, he shot forward like lightning and drove a monstrous punch straight into one thug's jaw. The man was launched into the air, spraying blood before crashing unconscious onto the forest floor with a heavy thud. Lizzie looked at him through tear-filled eyes, barely managing to whisper his name. A low growl rumbled from Juhwan's throat as he marched straight toward the remaining attackers. The blonde leader and the last thug froze in terror. Before either of them could even react, Juhwan grabbed the second man's collar and slammed a merciless knee into his face, knocking him unconscious instantly with a muffled groan. Terrified by the lightning-fast massacre, the blonde man desperately threw a wild punch. Juhwan slipped past it with flawless precision, grabbed him by the collar, and hurled him onto his back with enough force to make his bones crack against the forest floor. Straddling the fallen man, Juhwan clenched his fist and unleashed a savage barrage of punches, reducing his opponent's face to a bloody mess. As the brutal beating continued, Juhwan's mind burned with one cold, unwavering resolve. He had to carve absolute fear into these bastards, so they'd never dare set foot here again. Lizzie's piercing scream snapped him out of it. Her desperate warning rang out just as the blonde thug, somehow recovering, raised a sharp sickle. In a split second, Juhwan trapped the attacker's arm and ripped the weapon away, only to be caught completely off guard from behind. Someone locked him in a chokehold so tight that stars burst across his vision and blood spilled from his mouth under the crushing pressure. The chaos came to an abrupt halt with the hooded mentor's lightning-fast arrival. His commanding voice rang out with absolute authority, ordering Juhwan to let everything go and rein in his fury. Pointing a trembling finger toward the clearing, the old man barked at him to look at the state his own daughter was in. Juhwan clenched his teeth and silently turned his gaze. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, Dorothy was crying hysterically, reaching both arms toward him and desperately begging for help. Still lying on the ground, Lizzie stared at the scene in complete shock. The man who had once seemed incapable of hurting even a fly had just transformed into a terrifying force of nature, bringing back the painful memories of her first husband. Looking at the thugs sprawled across the ground, a chill briefly ran down Lizzie's spine as she imagined that she could have ended up just like them. But that fear vanished the instant her eyes met Juhwan's. There was no cruelty in his gaze, only the desperate urgency of a protector willing to tear the world apart to keep her safe. Noticing the troubled look on Juhwan's face, Lizzie realized he was worried that she was afraid of him. Holding a hand against her chest, caught between vulnerability and confusion, she couldn't understand why a man like him would care so much about frightening a woman she herself believed was worthless. Her body was still trembling slightly, and she wondered why she couldn't stop shaking when there was nothing left to fear. In a quiet voice, she softly called him husband. As she stared at the hurt expression on his face, she knew all she had to do was tell him she wasn't scared. But the language barrier stole the words from her. She walked toward him with steady steps, calling his name until Juhwan gently wrapped his hands around hers. That single warm touch erased every lingering doubt. As long as she was by his side, she knew without question that no one would ever lay a hand on her again. Tears welled up in her eyes as an emotional smile spread across her face. She squeezed his hand and thanked him with all her heart. Surprised at first, Juhwan pulled her into a tight, protective embrace while she buried her face against his chest, repeating her words of gratitude. His rough, calloused hands gently rubbed her back as he silently wondered why she was thanking him so much. After all, in Juhwan's mind, he was the one who should have been thanking her. The peaceful moment didn't last long. Lizzie's eyes suddenly widened at the sound of a noise. She pointed toward the cabin and called out to Juhwan after spotting Dorothy crying at the window. Alarmed, the two of them rushed back, with Lizzie bursting through the door to make sure the little girl was unharmed. Standing by the window, Dorothy trembled from head to toe, quietly sobbing under her stepmother's frightened yet compassionate gaze. The flood of memories hurt far more than any beating ever had. She had wished for someone to save her, but seeing Juhwan's heavy fists crushing those men had shaken her to her core. Images of the bruised and swollen faces her mother and later Lizzie used to carry after the beatings came rushing back, making her terrified that her own face would end up the same way. Through her tears, she remembered that crying had only ever earned her more punishment, and she convinced herself that she needed to apologize. Breaking down completely, Dorothy threw herself into Lizzie's arms. She blamed herself for hiding instead of helping and desperately begged not to be abandoned or treated like a useless burden the way her father always had. Lizzie hugged her as tightly as she could, easing the child's fears by explaining that when their eyes had met earlier, she'd only pretended not to notice Dorothy so the thugs wouldn't find her. She assured her that none of what had happened was her fault. Clutching Lizzie's clothes with tear-filled eyes, Dorothy finally let out a shaky breath before asking if that was really true. Lizzie pulled her into another hug and assured her the danger was over. She explained that Daddy was here now to protect them. Dorothy frowned in confusion, remembering that her biological father had died. Lizzie smiled gently and explained that because she was now Juhwan's wife, he had become the new father of their home. The realization hit Dorothy like a freight train. A silent "no freaking way" echoed through her mind while Juhwan continued standing outside with his back turned, completely oblivious. Lizzie confirmed it, pointing out the enormous difference. Her late husband had beaten them without mercy, while their new protector fought only to defend his family. Everything suddenly clicked into place. Dorothy realized Juhwan had beaten up the thugs because he was her father now, and because she'd cried out for help. In one leap, she rushed to the window and shouted for Juhwan, wholeheartedly accepting that the giant, intimidating man had become her new father. Thinking about everything he'd done, a strong man who sheltered them from the cold, always smiled at them, brought them meat, and had even given her his family name, Dorothy felt her heart melt. She excitedly called Juhwan's name again at the top of her lungs. Startled, Juhwan turned around, saw the little girl, and immediately opened his arms with a warm smile. Dorothy launched herself straight into his embrace. Juhwan caught her effortlessly, figuring that even though she kept blurting out words he couldn't understand, her feelings were perfectly clear. Dorothy suddenly slipped out of his arms and sprinted toward the groaning criminals lying in the mud. With all her strength, she grabbed the rim of a heavy wooden bucket and peeked inside. Discovering a precious stash of fresh meat the thugs had accidentally dropped. Seeing her charging straight into danger, Lizzie and Juhwan both took off after her, shouting her name in panic. Caught red-handed, Dorothy stubbornly planted her feet, pouted dramatically, and kept dragging the oversized bucket with every ounce of strength she had. Watching from a distance, Juhwan couldn't help thinking the little girl's obsession with food bordered on terrifying, while Lizzie struggled to hold back a laugh. The tension disappeared the moment Juhwan reached her and casually lifted the heavy bucket with one hand. Dorothy's eyes sparkled with admiration as she let out a loud, heartfelt, "Whoa!" Seeing himself instantly promoted to hero status over nothing more than a bucket of meat, Juhwan figured being the family hero was actually pretty easy. From the doorway, Lizzie clapped her hands and told them to bring the supplies inside and get Dorothy away from there. The little girl happily spun around and ran back toward the cabin while Juhwan carried the bucket inside, escorted by a bouncing child who shouted, "Meat!" with every step. With peace finally restored to the little homestead, Juhwan let out a long sigh, stored the food somewhere safe, and headed back outside, walking toward the battered thugs who were still lying on the ground groaning in pain. The hooded old man suddenly appeared in front of Juhwan, furiously gesturing for him to stop beating or killing the intruders. After taking a moment to think it over, Juhwan realized his mentor was right. Ending up in prison or becoming a slave again wasn't an option. Throwing one last murderous glare at the men sprawled on the ground, he silently vowed that if those bastards ever crossed his path again, they'd suffer a fate worse than death. Taking the old man's advice, Juhwan decided to at least collect everything the thugs had left behind. Tools and supplies were essential for surviving in the mountains. As he turned toward the cabin, he saw Lizzie gently cradling Dorothy in her arms. The heartwarming sight brought a soft smile to his face as he headed inside, ready to start over in peace. While putting away the salvaged tools, Juhwan made a promise to himself. Losing one family had already happened once, and it would never happen again. Smiling with quiet determination, he looked at Lizzie and Dorothy, silently swearing to protect them no matter what. Walking over to Lizzie, he gently cupped her face, carefully brushing his fingers across the bruise on her cheek, while thinking that if he ever mastered magic, he could erase that mark in the blink of an eye. Lizzie leaned into his touch, holding his hands and smiling as she assured him she was fine. Juhwan immediately blushed bright red, earning a warm laugh from her. Then, noticing how cold the floor was, he suddenly scooped her into his arms to keep her from the chill. The moment he did, he froze. The bruise on her face had completely disappeared. Eyes wide and cheeks burning red, Juhwan stared at his wife in disbelief, wondering if the old man's magic training had actually worked. Breaking into a triumphant grin, he silently celebrated awakening healing magic, while Lizzie simply blinked at him in confusion, convinced her husband must have hit his head a little too hard. Far from there, in a quiet village nestled against the forest, a white chicken squawked and ran off after someone accidentally stepped on it. A village woman grumbled in annoyance, complaining that the bird couldn't even recognize its own owner and insisted on pecking at everything in sight. Standing beside her, a farmer wearing a green vest crossed his arms and asked whether donating a little cloth to the mountain guardian was really such an unbearable sacrifice. Boiling with frustration, the woman demanded to know how many times she'd have to explain just how important the mountain guardian was to the safety of the entire village. The man admitted she had a point, but argued that giving away fabric they'd been saving for 10 years still seemed excessive. She shot back that they had no choice. The outsider looked like a hardened warrior who'd spent his life bathing in blood, and if more villagers died or got injured, that year's harvest would be completely ruined. The farmer called her narrow-minded for failing to see the bigger picture. She exploded in outrage, asking just how big that picture had to be for him to hand over her precious roll of cloth without thinking twice. But the memory of the previous day lingered in the man's mind. He had personally watched the beast bite wounds covering Juhwan's body disappear in an unbelievably short time. Realizing Gus's stories had been true all along, a chill ran through him as he concluded that the Mountain Guardian was an elite healing mage, a rarity so valuable that even the nobility would kill to possess someone with such power. A greedy smile slowly spread across his face. If the royal family wanted someone with abilities like that, he could sell the mage for a fortune and secure a life far beyond anything a simple village chief could ever dream of. Thinking the villagers were too foolish to notice anything unusual and convinced no one else knew the truth, he decided the only real danger was competition. If rumors spread and a noble house or powerful guild claimed the young man before he could profit from him, everything would be lost. The only trustworthy piece on the board was old Gus. As long as Gus kept an eye on Juhwan, the village chief instructed the woman to get close to the guardian's wife. According to Gus, the young man learned incredibly fast and was far too perceptive for his own good. If they made even one mistake, he'd discover they had been skimming supplies that belonged to the local lord and expose them. Since the guardian seemed completely devoted to his new wife, getting close to Lizzie would also give them opportunities to bargain for rabbit pelts at bargain prices. Grumbling that she understood, the woman turned around and walked away, ending the conversation. Left alone, the village chief reflected that some jobs simply required a woman's touch. Still, he quickly concluded that they needed to return at least part of the belongings stolen from the outsider's cabin. The guardian wasn't some helpless nobody like their previous victims. Ignoring him would only invite disaster later. Tossing a few sticks into the campfire, he wore a sinister smile. It was a shame to give up part of the loot, but there was no other choice. Several days later, proving that sometimes you have to give up a little to save everything, the scene shifted back to the cabin. Juhwan happily hummed to himself, overjoyed to see Lizzie smiling again. Inside, while organizing bags and jars, Lizzie quietly wondered about the village chief's sudden generosity. Apparently, he hadn't thought a single roll of cloth was enough, because he'd sent even more food and supplies that very morning. Watching his wife's radiant smile as she carefully sorted through the containers, Juhwan scratched his head in mild disbelief, unable to understand how recovering a few old belongings and some basic ingredients could make someone so genuinely happy. The smile on Juhwan's face said it all. Lizzie looked even happier now than she had when he'd magically healed the bruise on her cheek. Thinking that true happiness really was found in life's simplest moments, he silently reminded himself how deeply he loved his wife and how unbelievably lucky he was to have her by his side. Walking over to her, Juhwan casually announced that he was heading out. Lizzie repeated his words in surprise. He answered with a playful nod and a grin, pointing toward the door. Waving goodbye from the entrance, he promised he'd be back soon. Lizzie smiled warmly and reminded him to be careful. As Juhwan headed down the mountain trail, he remembered that Gus had planned to hunt rabbits that day. He wondered whether the hunt would be successful, especially for Dorothy's sake, since she spent practically every waking moment begging for meat, stomping her little feet, and dancing around with bones clutched in her hands. Making his way through the forest in search of prey, a moral dilemma weighed on Juhwan's mind. If he actually found a cute little rabbit, would he really be able to kill it? Shaking his head to beat the softness out of himself, he silently cursed, convinced he had to burn away every ounce of his modern-day sensitivity if he wanted to survive as a hunter. That train of thought completely fell apart the moment he pictured a fluffy little ball of fur. An instant later, that image somehow transformed into Lizzie wearing bunny ears. Juhwan immediately blushed, covered his face, and admitted to himself there was no way he could ever hurt something that adorable. If they had to hunt something, it should at least be ugly. The sharp snap of breaking branches shattered his thoughts. From the thick bushes emerged a grotesque, furry creature with glowing crimson eyes and a small horn protruding from its forehead. It stared directly at him, freezing Juhwan in complete shock. Several days later, the scene shifted to Juhwan returning to the cabin. Rubbing his temples with one arm, he dragged his feet home, visibly exhausted and frustrated by the bizarre encounter he'd had in the forest. After finishing all the household chores, hauling barrels of water, and splitting every last piece of firewood, he finally had some free time. giving him the perfect opportunity to experiment with his magic. Healing injuries had become surprisingly easy ever since that incident, but staring at his palms without seeing even the tiniest spark drove him crazy. Trying to figure out the limits of his abilities, he wondered whether his magic only worked when his life was actually in danger. Gathering the flow of mana into the core of his body, he stretched one arm forward and dramatically shouted, "Firestorm!" Nothing happened. Not even a match could have been lit. Lowering his arm with a defeated sigh, Juwan grumbled that since his expectations had already been rock bottom, he couldn't exactly say he was disappointed. Then another thought suddenly crossed his mind. Dorothy would absolutely lose her mind if he could snap his fingers and summon real flames. Healing magic was honestly pretty lame. It didn't glow, it didn't explode, and worst of all, Dorothy didn't seem remotely impressed by it. Letting out a frustrated sigh, Juwan lamented the fact that he couldn't wow the little girl with flashy fire magic. Then his eyes suddenly widened. Tiny sparks crackled at the tip of his index finger. A thin little flame finally flickered to life. Staring at the tiny flame dancing on his fingertip, he couldn't help thinking it looked about as impressive as the weak flame from an old disposable lighter. Before he could complain any further, Dorothy stumbled sleepily out of the cabin, rubbing her eyes. The moment she focused on him, her eyes went wide. She pointed at him and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Daddy's hand is on fire." Startled, Juwan instinctively pulled his hand back and warned her to stay away before she got burned. Ignoring him completely and already planning to excitedly tell Lizzie about her dad's new superpower, Dorothy rushed right up to him with star-shaped eyes, letting out a huge "Whoa!" At that exact moment, Lizzie burst through the doorway, only to freeze in place after witnessing the tiny fiery miracle. As the flame danced across Juwan's fingertip, Lizzie stared in disbelief, stammering about the fire coming from his hand, while Dorothy excitedly called for her mother to come look at Daddy's fire magic. Watching both of them stand there completely speechless, Juwan scratched the back of his head. Since they seemed to enjoy the show so much, it would have been nice to conjure something bigger. Unfortunately, that felt completely impossible. Still, knowing he could now use both healing magic and tiny flames, he figured at the very least he'd never struggle to light damp firewood during winter again. The little magic show, however, came to an abrupt end. Lizzie suddenly let out a strangled gasp, covered her mouth with both hands, spun around, and hurried back inside the cabin before shutting the door behind her. Left standing alone in the yard with a tiny flame on his finger, while Dorothy happily bounced around him, Juwan blinked in complete confusion, wondering why he'd gone through all that trouble for such a bizarre reaction. Trying to get rid of the flame, he stared at his fingertip and wondered how the heck he was supposed to turn it off. Unable to find some imaginary magical switch, he shrugged and decided he'd just live with his pocket-sized campfire until it burned itself out. The very instant he gave up, the flame disappeared on its own. Juwan let out a confused yell. This world's magic makes absolutely no sense. Still grumbling about how illogical magic was, he walked back into the cabin while calling for Dorothy. The moment he stepped through the doorway, he found the little girl leaning against a huge wooden barrel. Looking back at him with the saddest puppy dog eyes imaginable, she whimpered that the remaining pieces of meat were disappearing way too fast. Lizzie let out a quiet laugh while Dorothy continued pouting against the barrel. Juwan assumed the little girl's gloomy mood was entirely because they were running low on meat, but he quickly cheered himself up with a silent promise. "Dad's bringing home rabbit for dinner." Just as he reached the cabin door, however, a voice suddenly interrupted him with a simple question. "Are you ready?" Juwan looked up in surprise. Outside stood an elderly man with long white hair and a full white beard, wrapped in a green cloak and leaning on a wooden cane as he greeted him. Juwan adjusted his hunting gear and got ready to leave. Dorothy waved goodbye. Smiling warmly, he gently patted her on the head and praised her for being such a good girl. Beaming with pride, Dorothy happily accepted the compliment, while Juwan reminded both her and Lizzie to stay safe until he returned. The mood turns warm and intimate as Juwan and Lizzie share a small moment of affection, closely watched by Dorothy. The sweet moment is suddenly interrupted when he catches a suspicious smell. Leaning in for another sniff, he accuses Dorothy of secretly eating meat behind everyone's back, which she immediately admits with a mischievous grin. Leaving the cabin behind, Juwan heads straight for the area where Gus had set his traps. Along the way, the old man keeps the training going, quizzing him on which trees make the best firewood, and making him identify signs of nearby game from the tracks scattered across the forest floor. Suddenly, Gus raises a hand and firmly orders him to stop. Pointing ahead, Gus reveals an animal caught in one of the traps. The moment Juwan gets a good look at it, he freezes. Whatever this creature is, it's nothing like anything on Earth. Staring at the fanged beast with its fierce yellow eyes, he can't help comparing it to some horrifying mutant version of a kangaroo. As the creature roars and violently struggles to attack despite being trapped, Gus calmly studies it, concluding that it must have been caught only recently since it still has plenty of fight left in it. The beast thrashes wildly, drawing a faint smile from Gus. He declares that this is the perfect opportunity for Juhwan's baptism by fire, though he warns him that the challenge will be anything but easy. He tells him the truth. Bringing down a charging beast is on an entirely different level from hunting harmless animals. The shock of a hunter's first real kill is something a person remembers for the rest of their life. Then he orders Juhwan to take out the arrow he'd been given earlier. Looking over his student, Gus praises Juhwan for learning the language so quickly and already managing to form complete sentences despite arriving in the mountains only a short time ago. He makes it clear that this hunt belongs entirely to the rookie, promising to show him the harsh reality of hunting so the day will never be forgotten. As Juhwan steps forward, Gus instructs him to get closer and drive his first shot straight through the creature's foot. Staring at him in disbelief with his mouth hanging open, Juhwan blurts out the obvious question, why aim for its foot? Gus answers without hesitation. The brutal exercise is meant to teach him how to hit a living, moving target. First, cripple the beast, then deal with everything that comes afterward. As Juhwan tightens his grip on the bow with a knot forming in his stomach, Gus quietly reflects that the mountain shows no mercy and never goes easy on anyone. Anyone who fails to respect life will eventually receive the same cruelty from the beasts themselves, a lesson every hunter must learn if they ever hope to make it back home alive. The forest falls into heavy silence as Juhwan raises his bow and draws the string. As he lines up his shot, his thoughts spiral into conflict. Shooting the creature in the leg would only inflict needless pain without actually ending its life. To him, it feels like nothing more than a cruel exercise forced on him by the old man. Across from him, Gus motions impatiently, insisting that he shoot the leg first before aiming for the head. The beast bares its razor-sharp teeth, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on him as a chilling hiss echoes through the forest. The icy atmosphere drags Juhwan back to the day he first woke up in this cursed world, locked inside a filthy prison cell alongside countless other miserable souls while trapped inside a weak, powerless body. His thoughts drift back to that living hell, where corpses rotted in the darkness and humanity itself seemed to have disappeared. Then reality snaps back into focus. Staring at the struggling monster trapped before him, Juhwan finally understands. He may know nothing about surviving in these mountains, but one thing has become crystal clear. Gus isn't just teaching him to hunt, he's forging him into a real hunter. Accepting the brutal reality of this world, Juhwan steadies himself, releases the bowstring, and sends the arrow flying toward the creature. Deep within the dense forest, the young archer remains completely focused until the sharp whistle of his arrow ends with a solid impact, striking the monstrous rabbit-like creature cleanly. The beast staggers backward, bleeding and enraged, while Juhwan's eyes go wide with disbelief. I actually hit it. Far away, the old man in the green cloak immediately crushes the brief celebration with a sharp command. Again, confused by the urgency, Juhwan questions the order, only to receive another cold instruction. This time, aim for the front legs. The goal isn't to kill it, it's to cripple it. According to Gus, that is a mandatory part of the training. Juhwan raises his bow once more, but his thoughts drift to Lizzie and Dorothy, the emotional fuel behind every sacrifice he's willing to make. The beast's agonized growl shatters the silence. He closes his eyes for a brief moment, pretending not to hear its cries, forcing himself to treat them as nothing more than the sounds of an animal. His resolve hardens. If protecting and providing for the two people waiting at home means abandoning his hesitation, then so be it. With the bowstring fully drawn, Juhwan waits for the slightest opening, ready to deliver a ruthless attack. He no longer cares whether that makes him a coward or an executioner. As long as he fulfills his duty, the arrow strikes with a dull, brutal impact, sealing the beast's fate. That is how Juhwan is forged through sacrifice. His unwavering devotion to his family shapes him into their absolute protector, even if he is still an inexperienced hunter with countless challenges waiting for him in the depths of the forest. Later, sitting on the hard-packed ground, Juhwan stared down at his own hands, trying to process the violence of the day. He found some comfort in the natural law that survival meant humans and animals had to fight for their place in the world, but as he slowly clenched his fists, he silently vowed that he would never forget the mark left by his first blood-soaked hunt. The quiet moment of reflection ended when the old man in the green hood called out to him. Tossing a cloth sack onto the ground, he ordered Juhwan to haul the load back to the wagon so they could call it a day. Eyeing the bulky sack, Juhwan frowned at its weight and asked if he was supposed to carry everything at once. The old man thanked him for the help, but explained that they still had one last catch to make. With the heavy sack shoved into his arms, Juhwan made his way through the forest and couldn't resist taking a peek inside. Squinting at the contents, he noticed the creature looked very different from the others they'd caught. Eager to finish the hunt, the old man cut him off and told him to hurry so they could retrieve the final trap. Still hugging the sack, Juwon hesitated and asked for a moment. An idea had just occurred to him. Instead of slaughtering the animal, why not raise it? He reasoned that while smoked meat could last a long time, keeping a live animal would provide an emergency food supply if things ever became truly desperate. Stammering nervously and waving his hands as he tried to explain himself, he fully expected the old man to chew him out. Instead, to his surprise, the mentor smiled approvingly, stroked his chin, and agreed they should keep the animal alive. Relief immediately spread across Juhwan's face. Tightening his grip on the sack, he set off with renewed determination, ready to finish the hunt a different way. Back on the trail, he carefully carried his new burden while thinking about how to make the most of every opportunity to gain both knowledge and money. Eventually, they arrived at the old man's rustic cabin, where the mentor immediately started barking orders, warning Juhwan not to let his guard down. Inside, things finally settled down. Sitting quietly, Juwon passed the time carving a piece of wood while his thoughts wandered. Working with his hands had felt strange at first, but now he understood why. For the first time in his life, he had the family he'd always dreamed of. That alone gave him a genuine reason to keep living and pushing forward. Then he suddenly froze. His eyes landed on several old wooden tablets resting on top of the table. Walking closer, he carefully studied the carved symbols. Then it clicked. This was the written language of this world. His eyes lit up as he picked up one of the tablets, realizing that his future could become so much more than simply hunting animals in the forest. His nerves got the better of him as he struggled to put his request into words, stammering until the old man finally cut him off and bluntly asked what it was he truly wanted to learn. When the mentor followed Juhwan's gaze toward the wooden tablet, he stared at it in disbelief. Juhwan answered with unwavering determination, scratching the back of his neck and letting out a sigh that mixed surprise with reluctant acceptance. The old man walked over to a corner of the cabin and rummaged through his belongings before returning with a heavy stack of matching wooden tablets covered in inscriptions. He handed them to his student. Juhwan's face lit up with excitement. He practically begged to start learning immediately. The old man simply told him to follow. "Yes, sir," Juhwan answered enthusiastically. Seated together at the table beneath the sunlight pouring through the window, the young man gripped a feather quill as he practiced writing on parchment under his teacher's guidance, beginning with the most basic alphabet. Glancing over at the wooden tablets beside him, Juhwan couldn't help laughing to himself at the irony of his new life. He had expected nothing but hardship from this world. Instead, learning to read turned out to be the biggest challenge yet. With a sarcastic grin, he thought that if he'd known literacy required this much effort back on Earth, he probably wouldn't have bothered learning it there either. The old man eventually declared the writing lesson over for the day. While Juhwan remained seated, his mentor stared out the window, his mind already occupied with larger concerns. He couldn't stop thinking about the warning from the Lord of Goshen regarding the strange disturbances in the mountains. Remembering the goblin scouts they'd encountered before, he knew the unusual activity for that time of year would likely be ignored by those in charge. So he decided to act on his own. As he walked toward the door, he carefully weighed the risks. If they ran into experienced mercenaries, the two of them would be at a serious disadvantage since Juhwan was still little more than a beginner in combat. The hesitation in the old man's eyes slowly hardened into cold hatred. Silently, he vowed to hunt down every last one of those damned goblins and tear them apart. Far from the growing tension in the mountains, the scene shifted to a cozy little cabin. A brown-haired woman sat on the floor sewing a large piece of fabric, while a little blonde girl hovered nearby, constantly asking if it was finished yet. Smiling like a loving mother, the woman teased her by asking if she'd lost count of how many times she'd asked that same question. The little girl responded with innocent sincerity. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly broken by the sound of the front door opening. The woman immediately called out, "Julian?" Dorothy instantly took off toward the entrance, shouting, "Daddy," before throwing herself into Julian's arms. His serious expression melted into a wide smile as he scooped his daughter up with one arm while balancing the hunting bag in the other. Dorothy immediately started chatting non-stop about the housework and the cloth her mother had been sewing. But Julian's attention was stolen the moment he set the cloth sack down on the cabin floor. Out of nowhere, the sack suddenly starts squirming, startling Julian. Dorothy immediately crouches down, her eyes wide with curiosity, declaring that it has to be some kind of magic trick. Chuckling at his daughter's innocence, Julian spoils the mystery and tells her he'll show her what's inside in just a second. Still carrying Dorothy in one arm, he struggles to untie the ropes with only one hand, joking that he'd never try doing this one-handed again. Seeing her husband having trouble, Lizzie kneels beside him to help untie the knot. But the moment the rope loosens, a pair of long ears suddenly pops out of the sack. Pointing with wide eyes, Dorothy shouts that the creature moved, while Julian casually confirms that it's a rabbit. The one who truly gets startled is Lizzie, who jumps in surprise and falls backward onto the floor when the animal suddenly starts thrashing around. Trying to keep Dorothy from rushing in, Julian tells her to stay where she is while he gets the animal out. When the creature finally wriggles free of the cloth, Dorothy freezes in place, one hand covering her mouth as her eyes sparkle with complete amazement. The rabbit has a sharp horn growing from the middle of its forehead. Tilting its head in confusion, the strange creature stares back at them, completely ignoring the danger and utterly enchanted by its unusual appearance. Dorothy melts with excitement and declares that it's the cutest thing she's ever seen. Lizzie, on the other hand, instantly goes into full alert, stretching out both arms to stop Dorothy. She warns her that horns usually mean danger. Even though she's terrified, Lizzie decides to be brave for her daughter's sake and cautiously steps toward the animal with trembling legs. The instant the horned rabbit lunges at her, she lets out a sharp scream, squeezes her eyes shut, and blindly reaches out to grab it. Slowly opening her eyes, expecting to have been attacked, she freezes. The rabbit is sitting calmly in both of her hands. Blinking in disbelief, she wonders how she'd managed to catch such a skittish creature. While Dorothy stares in complete admiration, the little rabbit suddenly squirms. Pulling it closer, Lizzie notices the truth. The poor thing is trembling. It's covered in injuries. Dorothy's joy instantly turns into tears. Grabbing the hem of her mother's dress, she panics at the sight of the rabbit suffering before turning pleading eyes toward Julian. Please, save it. Caught completely off guard by being asked to save the very animal they'd hunted, Julian repeats her words in confusion before quickly stepping forward to help. Without hesitation, Lizzie gently places the horned rabbit into his hands. Holding the frightened little creature securely, Julian channels a stream of golden energy that begins shining brightly. He directs the healing light toward the wound on the rabbit's stomach. Almost instantly, the animal relaxes, soothed by the comforting warmth. Dorothy's eyes light up once again. Watching the rabbit's pain disappear, she cheers excitedly and declares that her dad is the most amazing person in the whole world. Embarrassed by the unexpected praise, Julian clears his throat and bends down to place the rabbit back on the ground so it can leave. Before he can, "Daddy, wait!" Dorothy's voice stops him. She dashes away and quickly returns carrying an empty woven basket. Understanding exactly what she means, Julian carefully places the little rabbit inside. The exhausted creature immediately curls into a ball and falls fast asleep. Watching the adorable sight, Dorothy beams with happiness. Grinning from ear to ear, Julian gives her an important mission. He tells her that from now on, she's responsible for protecting the little rabbit. Dorothy frowns in confusion until Lizzie gently explains that Daddy wants her to take care of their new little friend. Pointing proudly at herself, Dorothy eagerly accepts the responsibility. Overflowing with pride, she grabs both sides of the basket and solemnly promises that she'll protect the little rabbit no matter what. The entire family gathers around the basket on the wooden floor while Dorothy leans in close and quietly promises the sleeping bunny that it'll always be safe with her. Watching the scene unfold, Julian and Lizzie exchange a quiet, loving smile. Outside, peace settles over the stone and wood cabin as night slowly blankets the forest. Later, in the bedroom, Dorothy sleeps soundly with the basket holding the magical rabbit wrapped tightly in her arms. Nearby, illuminated only by the dim glow of a small lamp, Julian and Lizzie sit on the floor surrounded by wooden tablets as they continue studying together. Slowly sounding out each letter, Julian painstakingly works his way through the words while reflecting deeply on his own life. He admits to himself that human greed never truly disappears. At first, all he'd wanted was to escape that filthy prison wagon. Once he finally had a roof over his head, he immediately began dreaming of something bigger, a future where his daughter could grow up free. Turning back to the wooden tablets, he silently renews his newest goal. He has to learn how to read and write if he wants to keep his life moving forward. But when he glances over at the woman sitting beside him, warmth fills his chest. Out of everything he's gained, having her by his side is the greatest reward of all. Patiently helping her husband, Lizzie slowly reads the words carved into each wooden tablet, while Julian notices how exhausted she must be after working non-stop all day. Wanting to ease even a little of her burden, he quietly steps behind her and gently begins massaging her tense shoulders. Caught completely by surprise, Lizzie lets out a soft sigh. A faint blush spreads across her cheeks as her body slowly relaxes. With a shy smile, she quietly thanks him. The romantic mood deepens as Lizzie places her hands over Julian's, making him melt at the warmth of her touch before their fingers intertwine. The peaceful night gives way to a bright, sunny morning as a caravan of wagons rumbles down a dirt road winding through the dense forest. Inside one of the wagons, the ride is anything but comfortable. A gray-haired old man with a permanent scowl sits squeezed between the other passengers, grumbling non-stop about the constant jolts and the endless boredom. He complains that the trip to the information broker's city takes a day and a half, yet his whole body already feels stiff before they've even been traveling half a day. As he mutters about the outrageous travel fees and the steep price of information, a darker ambition slowly takes over his thoughts. Carefully weighing the risks, he reminds himself that while most healing mages are physically weak, that damned mountain guardian is in a league of his own. Remembering the guardian's towering figure standing over a man lying helpless on the forest floor, a greedy smile creeps across his face. Selling that information should earn him a hefty pouch of gold. His daydream is interrupted by the passengers chatting beside him. A man wearing a brown vest nervously brings up the war, wondering aloud if their kingdom should summon a hero as well. Across from him, a passenger in a green shirt replies that they've already tried several times, adding the rumor that the temple may have finally succeeded. The man on the left folds his arms skeptically, questioning whether the enemy nation's so-called hero is nothing more than an elaborate scam. The man in green nods in agreement, throwing more fuel on the fire by pointing out that no one has ever produced solid proof that this mysterious hero even exists. Living for centuries sounds ridiculous. Besides, according to the rumors, the man's appearance is completely unlike anyone else in the world, which should make an imposter easy enough to expose. Quietly listening from his cramped seat, the gray-haired man's stomach suddenly sinks. A bead of sweat rolls down his forehead as a horrifying realization strikes him. His village, despite being tucked away in the middle of nowhere, lies dangerously close to enemy territory. In an instant, greed gives way to fear. His priorities completely change. He needs to sell the information, collect his money, and get out of that village before the coming invasion catches everyone completely off guard. Meanwhile, the wagon continues rattling down the dusty road beneath the forest sun, carrying its passengers ever closer to the shadow of an approaching war. Back at the cabin, Dorothy lovingly peers into the woven basket, softly calling for the little rabbit to wake up so they can play together. Watching from nearby, Lizzie smiles and gently reminds her that the baby rabbit isn't food. Looking thoroughly offended, Dorothy blurts out, "Huh?" She pouts and calls her mom silly, insisting she's smart enough to know better than to eat a baby bunny. Trying not to laugh, Lizzie walks past her and teasingly tells her to wipe the drool off her face. Caught red-handed, Dorothy quickly wipes her mouth with an embarrassed little gasp. A sudden thought pops into her head. The rabbit needs food. She immediately dashes across the room, proudly announcing that she's going to feed all the animals. Outside in the sunlit yard, Dorothy comes to a stop in front of a half-finished wooden fence. Tilting her head in confusion, she wonders why Daddy is building a fence when they already have a perfectly good house to live in. The thought disappears almost instantly. Giggling to herself, she remembers what she was supposed to be doing and happily runs toward the enclosure. Reaching the pen, Dorothy stares at the two large, long-eared rabbits inside and wrinkles her nose. Compared to her adorable little horned rabbit, these ones are ugly. Tossing a bundle of fresh grass onto the ground, she tells one of the rabbits to eat everything by itself because she's far too busy today, reminding it to behave while she's gone. As she throws the grass into the enclosure, Dorothy suddenly notices even more plants sprouting from the ground out of nowhere. Her eyes go wide. She immediately concludes that she's awakened magical powers too. Clapping excitedly and laughing to herself, she starts imagining giant piles of wolf meat while picturing both of her parents staring at her in amazement because of her incredible magic. Far away from Dorothy's daydreams, the scene shifts back inside the cabin. Lizzie hugs a large black wolf pelt tightly against her chest, troubled by the merchant's wagon arriving soon and their lack of money. Running her fingers through the thick fur, she knows the merchant would gladly pay a good price for it. But she hesitates. It was Julian's very first successful hunt. The sentimental value makes it difficult to part with. Reality, however, quickly reminds her of everything they still desperately need just to survive. She silently goes through the list in her head. New clothes and boots for Julian, a canteen, a cooking pot, more food. Looking down at the lonely rabbit hide and the scissors lying on the floor, she realizes those alone won't earn them nearly enough. Her expression hardens. Raising both hands, she gathers her hair into a ponytail. Then she picks up the scissors. Determined to solve the problem herself, she prepares to cut off her own hair. Before she can make the first cut, Julian's voice echoes from outside, announcing that he's home. The moment he walks through the door, Dorothy comes running, happily shouting for her dad. Julian kneels down to hug her before turning to greet Lizzie. Then, something immediately catches his attention. His eyes widen. Cold sweat forms on his forehead as he stares at the drastic change in his wife's appearance. Pointing at her, Dorothy immediately complains. "Daddy, did you notice? Mommy's bald on one side, Now standing face to face with Lizzie, Julian quietly demands to know what happened to her hair. Calmly, Lizzie admits that she was the one who cut her hair. Dorothy crosses her arms, pouts, and grumbles that her mom's long hair looked way prettier. Alarmed by where this is going, Julian takes a step back, immediately realizing the sacrifice Lizzie tried to make. His heart tightens. Walking over to her, he softly tells her that seeing her hair cut actually hurt him, then gently apologizes, completely catching Lizzie off guard with such unexpected tenderness. Deep down, Lizzie can't help thinking her husband is unlike any man she's ever known. Around here, it was perfectly normal for a woman to sell her own hair so her family wouldn't go hungry. But Julian's kindness tears down every wall she'd built, leaving her eyes glistening with tears as she throws herself into a tight embrace, her heart overflowing with happiness. Watching the scene unfold, Dorothy breaks into a huge smile, making the moment feel like the perfect picture of a happy family. Soon, it's time to head out. Dorothy excitedly asks her mom to come along too. Lizzie gently declines, saying the load would be too heavy. Without missing a beat, Dorothy jumps onto Julian's back, settling into the wooden carrier and enthusiastically shouting that they're ready to go. Julian carries his daughter while Lizzie walks beside them, wrapped in a brown cloak. Before long, the three of them arrive at a lively village bustling with people weaving between rows of wooden houses. Running ahead, Dorothy suddenly announces that she smells something delicious. Standing in the middle of the crowded streets, Julian finds himself wondering how long it's been since he last walked through a place filled with people. His thoughts drift back to a lonely Christmas before he ever arrived in this world. The contrast hits him all at once. Back then, he wandered through crowds completely alone. Now, he has a wife and a daughter who's absolutely thrilled just to be outside together. A small smile spreads across his face as he quietly enjoys the simple peace of spending time with his family, while Dorothy races ahead, shouting excitedly the entire way. She suddenly stops in front of a huge cauldron at one of the market stalls, eager to inspect everything around her, while a nearby merchant loudly advertises that he's paying top coin for valuable goods. Dorothy suddenly freezes when she spots a blonde little boy wearing a red robe. Pointing straight at him, she blurts out that he looks just like the rabbit. The confused boy has absolutely no idea what she's talking about. A moment later, Julian and Lizzie catch up to keep an eye on their energetic daughter. The attention soon shifts as Lizzie places their trade goods on a merchant's counter, the bundle of her freshly cut hair and an animal hide. A gray-bearded merchant carefully inspects the items before claiming that the market is already flooded with hides like this one, driving the price way down. Lizzie gasps in surprise. Meanwhile, the merchant secretly admires the flawless condition of the pelt. It's worth a fortune, but he hides his excitement, hoping to cheat her into accepting almost nothing for it. Suddenly, Julian steps up behind his wife. His towering presence alone startles the merchant. Without saying a word, Julian reaches forward and snatches the pelt back with enough force to shove the old shopkeeper backward. The merchant yelps in surprise, instantly realizing just how unbelievably strong this customer is. Keeping a cold expression, Julian calmly says they'll simply try selling it in another town. He can already tell the merchant is lying. The old shopkeeper immediately panics. Stammering, he asks if they're really walking away and insists he was only following the official market price. Lizzie quietly points out that another town is a long trip away. Julian simply reassures her that they'll get there before she knows it. Meanwhile, the merchant curses himself for getting greedy too soon. He knows perfectly well that the pelt is actually worth a great deal. Watching the sale slip away, the merchant lets out a nervous laugh, accepts defeat, and sweetens the deal by throwing in salt, a cooking pot, and a set of men's clothes. Completely confused, Lizzie wonders why his attitude changed so suddenly, but Julian gently takes her by the arm, saying they'll find someone who'll offer them a fair price instead. Without hesitation, she agrees. As they turn to leave, Julian briefly considers carrying Lizzie to spare her the walk, but she smiles and insists she's perfectly capable of walking on her own. Sweating nervously, the desperate merchant shouts after them, begging them to wait. He laments that it was the finest item he'd seen all day and dramatically declares that losing the deal will ruin him. A little farther down the road, Dorothy proudly puffs out her chest and shouts to the other children that the giant over there is her dad. Calling her back over, Julian tells her it's time to go. Dorothy happily runs after him, waving at everyone while repeatedly shouting that he's her father. Wrapped in the comforting warmth surrounding her, Dorothy quietly reflects on how safe she feels with her strong dad protecting her. The strange contrast between the cold she used to know and the warmth she feels now finally makes sense when she realizes she's tucked snugly inside Julian's coat. Suddenly, she remembers something important. Poking her head out, she excitedly reminds everyone about the rabbit and asks to be put down so she can feed it. Julian gently sets her on the ground. Clutching a fresh bundle of grass, Dorothy races toward the enclosure while both of her parents watch with warm smiles. But the moment she reaches the fence, her world falls apart. The enclosure is empty. Her eyes go wide with shock. The grass slips from her hands. She immediately breaks down into uncontrollable sobs. Lizzie rushes over to comfort her, while Dorothy points toward the empty pen, buries her face in her hands, and cries out for her little rabbit. Julian comes running out of the house after hearing the loud crying. Taking in the scene, he asks if all the tears are really over a rabbit, but then he freezes when he notices that even Lizzie's eyes are filled with tears, wondering why she's crying too. As Lizzie tries to hide her sobs behind her hands, Julian can't help finding the whole situation a little funny. He bursts into an incredulous laugh and jokingly asks if they're really going to be this heartbroken just because one runaway rabbit escaped. Offended by his laughter, Dorothy spins around and starts pounding on his leg with her tiny fists, shouting that she hates him. Finding his daughter's furious little tantrum absolutely adorable, Julian laughs even harder, thinking he can always catch another rabbit someday. For a brief moment, he quietly appreciates how wonderful it is to laugh and cry over something so simple. But that peaceful moment doesn't last. Night falls. Hidden among rocks and thick bushes, a bearded man wearing a hood stares toward the horizon with a sinister grin. At last, he's found the goblin's nest. Their glowing red eyes pierce through the darkness, giving away their location. Deep in the forest, an aggressive goblin growls, smoke curling from its mouth as it suppresses the urge to charge recklessly, knowing that attacking the entire group alone would be nothing short of suicide. Watching from the shadows, the elderly bearded man calmly studies the goblin's miserable camp. It's overcrowded. They're starving. There aren't enough females. To him, it's only a matter of time before the monsters start tearing each other apart. All it takes is one goblin losing control and attacking the nearby village. Then the entire horde will spiral into chaos. Carefully assessing the threat, he reflects that individually these creatures are weak compared to many other monsters. Their true danger lies in their overwhelming numbers and in how quickly they reproduce. Like rabbits, he remembers the horrors left behind by goblin raids, where women are kidnapped and forced to bear children until they're completely broken, condemned to lives of endless misery. With spring awakening the monster's instincts, the old man reaches a grim conclusion. Every last goblin must be exterminated, and Julian will be the key to making that happen. As he makes his way back through the dark forest, guilt briefly weighs on his conscience. He knows he's about to take advantage of Julian's sincere gratitude. Even so, he convinces himself that pushing the young man into this massacre is the only possible solution. Morning finally arrives. Inside the cabin, Lizzie sleepily stretches and yawns as she walks through the house. Noticing the front door standing open, she calls for her husband. When she looks outside, she freezes. Several rabbits are hanging nearby. The sheer size of the morning's hunt leaves her speechless. A moment later, Julian walks into view carrying an axe over his shoulder and casually asks if she came outside to grab another rabbit. A brief flashback follows. Julian desperately tries to catch one alive in the forest, only to lose his footing and crash flat onto his back while the rabbit leaps away to freedom. Still lying on the ground, he grumbles in frustration that his plan to bring one home alive has completely fallen apart. Grinding his teeth, determination blazing in his eyes, he jumps back to his feet and sprints after it. No way you're getting away. Back in the present, Julian awkwardly scratches the back of his neck and casually brushes it off, claiming it was easy and that he caught them in no time. Completely amazed, Lizzie claps her hands excitedly, showering him with praise before asking how they'd like to cook the meat. Roasted or preserved with salt? Julian votes for roasted rabbit. Though confused at first, Lizzie quickly understands what he has in mind and suggests roasting it with coarse salt, beaming as she promises to make a meal everyone will love. Outside, as the rabbit slowly roasts over the fire, Julian enjoys the aroma of bamboo smoke soaking into the meat. When the fire starts dying down, he casually summons a tiny spark onto the tip of his finger. He still considers the ability pretty underwhelming and not especially useful. Shrugging it off, he focuses on the food instead, feeding the flames before his hungry family has to wait any longer. Then, everything explodes. A massive burst of fire suddenly engulfs the entire cooking pit. Julian panics. Frantically waving his arms toward the inferno, he desperately begs the flames to spare his family's meal. His panic slowly gives way to confusion as he notices the small flame still dancing harmlessly on his fingertip. Why did the spell work like that this time? Then, it finally clicks. The magic isn't created inside his own body. His thoughts race back to the battle with the wolf. The fire hadn't shot from his hands. It had appeared directly on top of the beast. Calmly thinking it through in the daylight, he realizes that if the magic doesn't originate from his own body, that explains why he's never burned himself. To test the theory, he raises his burning finger right next to his face. Nothing happens. He's completely immune to his own flames. Now curious, he decides to figure out exactly how far this power can go. Returning to the campfire, Julian crouches beside a piece of raw meat. Closing his eyes, he imagines a gentle, perfectly even roast. Reality has other plans. The instant the spell activates, another wild blaze erupts and completely swallows the meat. Julian's eyes bulge as cold sweat runs down his face. He can't believe he just ruined lunch. But once the flames finally die down, he blinks. The meat is perfectly cooked, golden brown, juicy, absolutely flawless. Relief quickly turns into excitement. At last, he's finally figured out how to trigger and control his fire magic, and lunch is saved. As soon as the three of them gather inside the cabin, the mouth-watering aroma of the meal fills the room. Lizzie is immediately impressed by the dish, complimenting the incredible smell before asking what it's called. Trying not to give himself away, Julian almost blurts out chicken, but quickly catches himself and simply calls it a roasted dish, keeping the fact that the main ingredient is rabbit a secret. Meanwhile, Dorothy eagerly drums her hands on the table, more than ready to dig in. With a satisfied grin, Julian slices the roast down the middle and serves everyone generous, juicy portions. The reaction is immediate. Lizzie's cheeks flush as she savors her first bite, while Dorothy's eyes sparkle with pure delight. Folding his arms proudly, Julian realizes that watching his family eat their fill is even more satisfying than eating himself. Their wonderful meal comes with an even bigger reward. Now that he's finally figured out the trick behind it, controlling his fire magic becomes almost effortless. While practicing in the forest, he can already hit rocks from several feet away with pinpoint bursts of flame, making him realize that using this power against another person would be absolutely devastating. Looking down at his own hands, he reaches a comforting conclusion. With healing magic in one hand and fire magic in the other, he now has everything he needs to protect Lizzie and Dorothy from any threat. His thoughts drift toward the hooded old man who started him on this path. Chuckling to himself, Julian jokes that when Christmas finally comes around, he's going to build the mountain Santa his own little shrine. His ridiculous train of thought is suddenly interrupted by an excited shout from inside the cabin. The rabbit they've been keeping alive has finally woken up. Curious, Julian listens as Dorothy happily chats non-stop with the little rabbit, proudly promising to give it a complete tour of the cabin. A few moments later, she proudly marches through the house, carrying the rabbit inside its woven basket, her face glowing with excitement. The grand tour begins beside the fireplace. With all the seriousness of a professional guide, Dorothy proudly announces that this is the kitchen, the sacred headquarters where all the delicious food comes from. Then she points to the side. And this is a wall. The poor rabbit simply stares back in complete confusion. Continuing the tour, Dorothy stops in front of Lizzie, who is busy cleaning the floor. With absolute confidence, she formally introduces her mother, insisting that the rabbit memorize her face because it should never ever forget her. The little bunny flinches in surprise. At that exact moment, Julian walks through the front door. Dorothy's face instantly lights up. She rushes over to him, proudly lifting the basket and telling the rabbit to say hello to Daddy, before answering for it herself in a tiny squeaky voice. The adorable moment comes to an abrupt halt when Dorothy casually announces that she named the rabbit after herself. Julian freezes. A confused noise escapes his throat. Across the room, Lizzie also stops what she's doing, completely unable to understand the child's logic. An awkward silence fills the cabin as the two adults desperately try to figure out why Dorothy would give the rabbit her own name. Still wearing thoroughly confused expressions, Lizzie forces an awkward smile, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Julian repeats Dorothy's name aloud, and his imagination immediately runs wild. He slowly turns toward Lizzie. A look of stunned realization spreads across his face. Surely, there's a huge secret hiding beneath those clothes. Without another thought, he suddenly drops to both knees with a loud thud. His eyes sparkle as he imagines a tiny little angel peacefully sleeping among the clouds. Gently wrapping his arms around Lizzie's waist, he gazes up at her in amazement. There's a baby in there. Completely baffled, Lizzie looks down at him and softly calls his name, trying to figure out what on earth he's talking about. Then, it finally clicks. Her face instantly turns bright red. Eyes wide with embarrassment, she hurriedly takes several steps backward, wildly waving both hands as she desperately shuts down her husband's ridiculous misunderstanding. The word baby is officially forbidden in this house. Left kneeling with both hands, still reaching into empty space, Julian wears the expression of a man whose soul has just left his body. Huh? Quietly gathering what remains of his dignity, Julian tells himself that, honestly, maybe it really is too soon for another child. It would probably be wiser to wait until their lives become a little more stable. Still kneeling there while trying to recover from the embarrassment, he suddenly notices Dorothy standing beside him, gently rocking the basket. Tilting her head, she innocently asks why Daddy is posing so dramatically. Looking at his daughter with a warm smile, Julian lets the awkwardness melt away. He silently reminds himself that his greatest mission is to become the father she always deserved, and give her all the love she was denied in the past. Amused by his dramatic reaction, Dorothy giggles and teases him, saying that Daddy looks exactly like the rabbit. As Julian glances into the basket, something immediately catches his attention. The tiny horn on top of the rabbit's head looks longer than before. At first, he hadn't paid much attention. After all, this world was already filled with magic and gigantic wolves, but now, the little creature looked far too unusual to pass for an ordinary rabbit anymore. That is how the young man is forged through sacrifice, earning the title of his family's unwavering protector through absolute devotion, even though he is still inexperienced in battle and destined to face many more trials waiting in the forest. Without wasting a second, the old man turns on his heel and quickens his pace, ordering Julian to stay close behind him. Slightly thrown off by the urgency, Julian obeys and follows his mentor toward the back of the cabin. Stopping beside the chopping block surrounded by stacked firewood, Gus takes charge. Gripping an axe, he positions a log and tells the young man to pay close attention. He drives a sharpened wooden wedge into the log, then swaps the axe for a hammer, instructing Julian to control his strength instead of driving the wedge all the way in with one blow. With a sharp crack, the log splits apart. Watching closely, Julian finally understands. The old man isn't relying on brute strength to split the wood. Instead, he surrounds the log with several wedges, gradually forcing the grain apart. Beneath the fading afternoon sun, the hands-on lesson continues as Gus demands his full attention with every strike. Inside the wooden cabin, sitting across from old Gus at the workbench, Julian senses that something is wrong. Although the old hunter had promised to teach him how to make a bow, his unusual sense of urgency raises every alarm, prompting Julian to ask whether something has gone terribly wrong in the mountains. Confused by the sudden mention of wolves, Julian presses him for an explanation. As serious as ever, Gus points toward the sky, explaining that the flock of birds circling high above the mountain range is the classic sign that a human has become food for wild beasts. Cutting the conversation short, the old man places a practice arrow into Julian's hands, tells him to keep practicing at home, and sends his apprentice away with the promise of continuing the lessons another day. Respectfully, Julian thanks him before leaving, crossing the yard beneath the warm afternoon sun. The moment Julian is gone, the atmosphere inside the cabin turns grim. Gus's expression hardens into something cold and unsettling. The scene shifts to the vast mountain range under the blazing daylight, where danger hangs heavily in the air. Standing alone before an arsenal of spears and blades, the old hunter recalls the day he went down to the village to confront its chief and warn him about the goblin infestation, a revelation so serious that the village leader immediately sent his own son racing to the neighboring city in search of help. Standing alone before a group, weighing the risks, Gus places his faith in the local adventurers guild, believing that the hired adventurers won't take long to march into the mountains and eliminate the monsters. Even so, the old hunter's expression remains heavy. Years of experience have taught him exactly how goblins operate, and he knows they move far faster than human bureaucracy ever could. Then the final realization strikes him with bitter certainty. Connecting all the pieces, he understands that the birds Julian spotted weren't circling over wolves' kills at all. They were scavengers feasting on human corpses. The veteran hunter has already pieced together the coming disaster in his mind. Knowing that a small group of 5 or 6 people is isolated deep within the mountains, the worst-case scenario becomes painfully clear as the scene shifts to Lizzie gathering fruit in the forest, completely unaware that a massive goblin is watching her from the shadows. Gus realizes immediately that the lone woman has become the monster's next target. To him, the hunger and savagery bottled up inside those creatures are about to explode, dragging the entire village into catastrophe. Hidden in the darkness with the calculating eyes of a predator, the old man finally reveals his true colors. His plan is to use Julian and his family as bait, a living shield to delay the goblin horde and buy precious time. Fully confident in Julian's overwhelming strength, he coldly concludes that the young man will be able to handle it. Meanwhile, Julian hurries home, completely unaware of the truth. Gus watches his apprentice disappear into the distance with chilling calculation. In the old hunter's mind, if Julian's wife is slaughtered and his heart is shattered, then so be it. As long as Julian survives, he can always find another wife and rebuild his life afterward. Retreating into the darkness of his cabin, Gus quietly embraces what he believes will be the final hunt of his long life. Stretching out one arm, he draws an enormous sword and effortlessly raises the massive blade as though it weighs nothing. Staring at its cold steel reflection, where the images of Julian, Lizzie, and Dorothy appear standing together, the old hunter reveals an icy smile. For a hunter nearing the end of his journey, there is no greater glory than witnessing the conclusion of the bloodbath about to unfold.